Mr Speaker, and can I thank my honourable friend for that answer. I warmly welcome the Government's announcement that Tees Valley will be a location of one of the Government's new investment zones. That £80 million investment will unlock new opportunities for our region. Does my right honourable friend agree that this is further evidence of levelling up for Darlington and the Tees Valley, and can he outline a timescale of when we will see things start to happen?
I thank my honourable friend. The Tees Valley's investment zone will boost productivity and drive sectoral growth, whilst providing benefits for the local communities that he represents. The Government wants to make rapid progress on delivering investment zones. We're engaging with partners to ensure Government can support those with the ambition to move at speed to do so. We intend to have all proposals agreed by the end of the financial year, and sooner than that, if at all possible.
John Stevens.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. If we are to rebalance the economy and close the gap between the less successful areas and those that are more prosperous, then clearly business investment and wealth creation are going to be central. Would the Minister therefore agree that the prioritisation of investment zones in areas which need a helping hand is the right course of action, and does he envisage one in the Borderlands area in the near future?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question. He has been tireless in his advocacy for his constituents, and the areas in England eligible to host an investment zone were identified through a rigorous analytical assessment which reviewed every place in England and shortlisted based on their strengths in innovation, productivity potential and levelling up need, as well as the strength of local leadership, knowledge assets and sectoral strengths. Now, the Borderlands area that he refers to is already benefiting from the Borderlands growth deal signed just 2 years ago, worth £452 million, which aims to create 5,500 jobs. But of course, he's also familiar with the recent investment signed off through the Housing Infrastructure Fund for £134 million, leading to 10,325 homes in St Cuthbert's Garden Village.
Jim Shannon.
Mr Speaker, can I thank the Minister very much for that? He mentioned in his introduction, he referred to the 4 zones and 1 for Northern Ireland. Of course, I'm going to make a play for my constituency, Mr Speaker, as everyone would. So what discussions has the Minister had with the department back home in relation to a potential investment zone in my constituency of Strangford, just to ensure that the people there can have the same opportunities as others across all of the United Kingdom? Thank you.
Well, I think the whole House would agree that the honourable gentleman must be the most effective advocate for his constituents, and we will see what happens. There will be a rigorous process, there will be wide consultation, and we expect to have an outcome that will benefit his constituents and across the whole of Northern Ireland.
SNP spokesperson Stuart Hosey.
Mr Speaker, looking at the incentives for the investment zones, 100% business rates relief, enhanced capital allowances, with the exception of reduced NI contributions, it's hard to see the difference between an investment zone and what was offered for enterprise zones. So what additional fiscal support is the Government providing to differentiate these investment zones from enterprise zones?
Well, the key distinction is that we've identified areas that have cluster, often related to a university, have potential in a key sector. And this will be worth £80 million over 5 years. And obviously, we're working very closely with partners. It's difficult to be precise on the numbers because obviously there will be bespoke collaborations according to which sectors are involved.
Stuart Hosey.
Can I thank the Minister for that answer? But of course, enterprise zones, and indeed their near cousin, the Freeport, also would speak about clusters in the same kind of language. So what steps are the Government taking to ensure that investment zones don't suffer from the same problem that enterprise zones and Freeports suffered from, which was a woeful failure to deliver the number of permanent, good quality jobs which were initially promised?
I think that's a legitimate concern to raise, and I think that that's why we've followed that analytical approach that I referred to. We will be working closely with DLUC to look at each proposal by the end of the year, and having that certainty over the tax incentives over those 5 years, making local authorities an accountable body for the delivery of it. But I think he would agree. In fact, his whole political doctrine is about the distinctions that exist in different communities around the United Kingdom. And that's where we have a variety of interventions designed to make an effective impact in different places across the United Kingdom.
Number 2, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The Chancellor has regular discussions with Cabinet colleagues on a range of issues. Autumn Statement 2022 provided an additional £2.3 billion in funding for schools this year and next, over and above totals announced at the spending review in 2021. This means school funding next year will be £58.8 billion, exceeding 2010 levels of per pupil funding in real terms. And this will help schools to manage costs, including the costs of school meals.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since Liberal Democrats in government rolled out universal infant free school meals in 2014, funding for them has increased by just 11 pence. This is seeing, with soaring food costs, this is seeing a real shortfall in schools' costs, which are having to be subsidised by cutting teaching budgets. These shortfalls range from 11 pence in my own local authority of Richmond upon Thames per meal, 11 pence per meal, to as much as 39 pence per meal in Hampshire. So will the Treasury provide the extra cash so that free school meal funding reflects the true costs that schools actually face, or will the Minister continue to leave our schools and children shortchanged?
Well, I don't quite agree with that analysis. I mean, the free school meals funding for 23-24 was set in line with precedent every year, using inflation forecasts at the time in the autumn prior. And around 1.9 million pupils are claiming a free school meal at lunchtime, and that equates to 22.5% of pupils in state-funded schools. So, together with the 1.25 million infants supported through the Universal Infant Free School Meal Policy, it is having an impact. But I recognise the pressures across the whole of the economy, and that's why, as I said, the government gave those additional funds in the autumn statement last year.
Bob Blackman.
Number 3, Mr. Speaker.
The Edinburgh reforms take forward the government's ambition to maintain the UK's position as a world-leading global financial centre, whilst ensuring our financial sector remains robust in the face of market shocks. In particular, they introduce a new secondary duty of growth and international competitiveness, a first for UK regulators.
Bob Blackman.
Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for that answer. Clearly, the culture and performance of regulators is one of the key considerations that firms have when they choose to invest in the UK. What steps is he going to take to introduce key performance indicators for financial regulators to report on their delivery against the new growth and competitive objective in the Financial Services and Markets Bill? And is he considering any additional measures to add to the bill which would strengthen the independent scrutiny of regulators?
Well, my honourable friend does great service as chair of the all-party group on personal banking and fairer financial services, so he knows of what he speaks. The government today published a call for proposals on the metrics that regulators should publish to support scrutiny of their work. As every business leader knows, what gets measured gets managed. And that responds to the significant interest shown by industry and Parliament in ensuring that there are appropriate and transparent public measures to support scrutiny of the regulator's performance. The government is clear that with great power must come greater accountability.
One measure that would improve the regulatory framework for mutuals in the financial services sector, such as Royal London or Liverpool Victoria, would be the introduction of permanent mutual shares. Given that such a reform would allow a new safe route to access the capital that such financial mutuals need to expand, and without having to demutualise as well, could the Minister explain why the Treasury is still dragging its feet on the introduction of such a significant reform?
Well, as the honourable gentleman and myself have talked a number of times, the Treasury, I don't think it's fair to say the Treasury is dragging its feet. We've supported reform to the mutual sector. We welcome a diversity of provision, and that involves a greater expansion and more commercial freedom for the mutual sector. We're looking at with the Law Commission on taking their work forward to see if we can help. And I'm always happy to sit down with the honourable gentleman or with any representatives from the sector as part of my widespread programme of engagement.
Christine Jardine.
Question number 4, please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Energy Bills discount scheme will provide all eligible businesses and other non-domestic energy users with a discount on high energy bills for 12 months from the 1st of April 2023 to the 31st of March 2024. It will also provide businesses in sectors with particularly high levels of energy use and trade intensity with a high level of support. The scheme will help those locked into contracts signed before recent significant falls in the wholesale price manage their costs and provide others with reassurance against the risk of prices rising again.
Christine Jardine.
Oh, thank you very much. In my constituency of Edinburgh West, however, just this past week, speaking to businesses, they are not finding that the help is there that they need, that the combination of the cost of living crisis and energy costs and business rates is pushing them towards a crisis. The Federation of Small Businesses estimates that 93,000 small businesses could go out of business this year because of high energy costs. So does the government accept that more is going to have to be done, particularly to help small companies renegotiate tariffs? And can they tell me what they intend to do about that?
Well, the Honourable Lady raises an incredibly important point, and this government is very alive to the issues that businesses face across the country. Last year, she'll be aware that the EBRS was unprecedented in its nature and scale, and the government was always clear that that was going to be time-limited and intended as a bridge for businesses as wholesale gas prices come down. They have now come down quite significantly, but we do have the EBDS, which strikes the right balance between supporting businesses for another year, but also limiting the taxpayers' exposure to volatile energy prices.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Treasury was quick to act during the pandemic when hoteliers in Aberconwy told me that banks were directing them to their premium lending products instead of the government CBILS. And now those same hoteliers are telling me that the energy supply market seems to have failed. They're seeing their bills tripling just as market rates drop below government support levels. They fear that the supplier's thumb is on their side of the scales. Now, none of this will be new to the Minister, so can he tell me what he's doing, please? And can he also meet with myself and market and sector representatives to make sure that some common sense is brought back to energy supply contracts?
Well, my honourable friend is a great champion of businesses in his constituency. In the first instance, I would advise businesses to always contact suppliers to discuss their contracts. We are alive to the issue that some businesses are having difficulty securing the benefit of falling wholesale prices from their energy suppliers. The Chancellor wrote to Ofgem, who oversee the energy market for consumers, in January, and Ofgem have now launched an investigation into the non-domestic energy market. We await their conclusions, and at that point, I'd be very happy to meet with the honourable gentleman.
The Polber.
5, sir.
Minister.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to answer this question together with questions 9 and 11. The government's 3 economic priorities this year are to halve inflation, grow the economy and get debt falling. This will require patience and discipline. Countries around the world are facing rising prices, and we won't be able to make this go away overnight. But by sticking to our plan, we will halve inflation this year and help to ease the pressures that people are facing.
Price inflation is increasing far faster than the overall average increase in prices. And this is affecting the poorest, the hardest in Kettering and across the country. Is there any good news at all from His Majesty's Treasury about the prospects for food price inflation over the next 12 months?
Speaker, my honourable friend is a doughty champion for his constituents. The OBR this year does expect food, tobacco and alcohol inflation to fall significantly. But that's not all. The government recognises the challenges facing households due to the elevated costs of living in general, including food. So we took action at the spring statement to support struggling families. Taken together with previous action, support to households to help with bills is worth an average of £3,300 a year across this year and next.
French.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government are absolutely right to prioritise reducing inflation, given the significant impact this is having on families and businesses across the country. And I welcome the support the Minister has outlined for families in my constituency of Old Bexley and Sidcup. But can my honourable friend confirm what assessment has been made by the Treasury into the impact of over a decade of abnormal monetary policy following the global financial crisis?
As my honourable friend knows, monetary policy is the responsibility of the Independent Monetary Policy Committee and the Bank of England. We'll continue to work closely with them to ensure that monetary and fiscal policy are well coordinated. The Chancellor reconfirmed the inflation target of 2% at the autumn statement and confirmed this government will not change the target.
Well, Menzies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst inflation is now heading in the right direction, the effect of these price rises is still being felt by Files' older people. What steps is my right honourable friend taking? What conversations has he had with the DWP in order to make sure that Files' retired residents are being well protected?
Mr. Speaker, I and my colleagues work closely with colleagues in the Department of Work and Pension. As my honourable friend knows, on behalf of pensioners in Filed, more than 8 million pensioner households will receive a cost of living payment of £300 this winter, but more than 12 million pensioners have benefited from a 10.1% increase to their state pension. That's the biggest percentage rise in the state pension for over 30 years and its biggest ever cash increase.
Mr. McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Minister rightly said, monetary policy is made independently by the Monetary Policy Committee in this country, but the government is responsible for economic stability, and for that we need investment. So can I ask the Minister, what policies of the past couple of years does the Minister believe has got us into this position with inflation, and how is the government going to make sure that we have better economic stability going forward, given their recent record?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, of course, the Honourable Lady omits to mention both the headwinds from the global pandemic and Russia's aggression in Ukraine. And any financially literate conversation on this subject has to acknowledge that we're seeing very similar rates of increase in inflation and rising interest rates across the developed world. In that context, this government is focusing on stability, ensuring that we continue to pay down debt over the cycle and not, Mr. Speaker, do what the previous Labour government did and leave a note behind for their successors saying that there is no money left.
Listen to this. Listen to this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I couldn't quite hear you over the chatter. Food price inflation is standing at 19.2% in March, up from February, and this is causing severe problems for many of my constituents, particularly those who have no recourse to public fund status, meaning that they are not entitled to any support from the government whatsoever. What's he going to do to help those people really struggling and heading to the food banks because they can't afford to make ends meet?
Mr. Speaker, in the interest of time, I won't repeat for the Honourable Lady the support for households, which averages 3,500 people across the United Kingdom. If the Honourable Lady has constituents who have particular needs, the government has recently extended the £1 billion household support fund, and I suggest she works with her local authority to try and meet their needs through that.
Mr. Speaker. Inflation, of course, isn't just hitting individuals and families, it's also hitting councils and potentially infrastructure projects. Lodge Hill Junction on the A34 in Abingdon is one such key piece of local infrastructure that, when completed, will support jobs and housing across Oxfordshire, Science Vale and MHC and the economy as a whole. Homes England and MHCLG say the final piece of this funding now sits with the Treasury in the Brownfield Infrastructure and Land Fund. So would the Minister meet with me so that I can explain why this is such an important piece of funding to be released, and please can the government not be the last piece of this puzzle so that we can deliver Lodge Hill Junction once and...
It's absolutely nothing to do with the question. It's a bit of a struggle, isn't it, between them? Do you think you can answer it? No. OK, Paul in there.
Question number 6.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the Minister responsible for His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, may I wish His Majesty the King and Her Majesty the Queen a very long and successful reign, and the 63,000 members of staff who work for HMRC will be proud to try to help His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, as they are bound to do. The Government is aware of concerns about employment practices in the hair and beauty sector. These concerns are largely focused on the so-called rent rent-to-chair model, which is a long-standing practice and a legitimate alternative to employing stylists, provided the parties involved follow the relevant rules. The government is committed to tackling disguised employment, and HMRC will consider any evidence suggesting businesses have misclassified individuals for tax purposes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Minister for her answer. It's estimated that 70% of the hairdressing industry is currently operating under a self-employed model to avoid PAYE, national insurance and VAT. According to HMRC guidelines, these salons often amount to disguised employment. The problem is that all apprentices, and 90% of hairdressers learn through apprenticeships, must be trained in salons that pay their tax, an increasingly unattractive model. Would the Minister consider how we can taper VAT rates or enforce disguised employment rules more stringently in order to ensure that we have appropriately trained hairdressers in the future?
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure I am joined by all members of the House for thanking my honourable friend for her interest in ensuring that we have hairdressers in 15 years' time. We recognise the important role that hairdressing salons play in the education and training of apprenticeships, and indeed funding for employer-led apprenticeships will grow to £2.7 billion in 2024-25, which will help to pay for the cost of training and assessment. However, she is quite right to pinpoint the need for those participating in the industry of hairdressing to ensure they are following the rules correctly. It is not their choice. There are very strict criteria and they must make sure that they follow it. But I very much look forward to discussing this in further detail with my honourable friend later this week or next week.
Well, Farrell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The hair and beauty industry is characterised by a high percentage of female entrepreneurs and young people. However, that workforce continues to be at risk of disguised employment. What steps are ministers taking to ensure that self-employed individuals are aware of their tax expectations so that women and young people can continue to thrive in this sector?
Wonderful that we have so many women setting up their own businesses and taking that step into entrepreneurship. She's absolutely right, though, to ensure that, I don't know, there's chuntering opposite, they seem to be disagreeing with this. She's right to ensure, though, that we help entrepreneurs, whether male or female, to understand the rules when it comes to tax. And so this is why we provide guidance and support for customers to help them understand employment status, and we have agreed guidelines specifically with the National Federation of Hairdressers to help them communicate with their industry as to which rules apply to which hairdressers.
Alexander Stafford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with your permission, I would like to answer this question together with question number 15. The government is taking action to protect struggling families by providing support to households to help with higher bills worth £3,300 per household on average over this year and last. This includes targeted support to the most vulnerable in our society through additional cost of living payments and the uprating of benefits by 10.1% this year. The government has also increased the national living wage by 9.7%, representing an increase of over £1,600, the annual earnings of a full-time worker on the national living wage.
Alexander Stafford.
Thank my rightful friend for that answer, but does he also agree with me that the best support for the cost of living, beyond the £94 billion this government has already spent, is by cutting inflation, which will ease pressure especially on food, fuel and energy for families in Rother Valley and up and down the country?
Absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and the government is doing three things to reduce inflation. We're remaining steadfast in supporting the independent MPC at the Bank of England as they continue to take action to return inflation to target. We're making responsible decisions on tax and spending, so we're not adding fuel to the fire. And third, we're tackling high energy prices by holding down energy bills for households and businesses alongside investing in long-term energy security.
David Simmons.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Lowest income households in my constituency are the biggest beneficiaries of a strong economy. So does my right honourable friend agree that reducing debt, reducing inflation and balancing the books are the most effective government interventions to support low income households?
Absolutely, I agree with my honourable friend. It's right that we continue to support the cost of living challenges, the energy price guarantee I've mentioned, but also sticking to that plan to avoid unnecessary inflationary pressure. On average this year, as a result of government decisions made from autumn statement 20...
Order. We're going to have to carry this on at another time. Carry on. Sorry, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a result of government decisions made from autumn statement 22 onwards, households in the bottom half of the income distribution will see twice as much benefit from government support as households in the top half of the income distribution in cash terms.
Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened with interest to the answer the Minister gave about support for households, but it doesn't match up with the reality in Rotherham, where constituents have had increases in rent, in mortgage, in fuel, in food and cuts to public services. So what is he actually going to do to deliver the support we need to make ends meet? Because the offers on the table are not cutting it.
Well, I think everyone can see that the government's made a range of interventions over the last 2 years, and that means support for all of those on means-tested benefits. That's 8 million people. 8 million pensioner households will also benefit from the non-discretionary payments effectively. And then the Household Support Fund, which we repeated, put another £1 billion to give local authorities that discretion to, in individual circumstances, to add supplementary support. Of course, I recognise that this is an incredibly challenging time for the most vulnerable, but we've tried to target those interventions to the most vulnerable, listen to the Low Pay Commission, increase the national living wage as well to £10.42, but recognising that these are difficult times, but we will get through them.
Number 8,
please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I should like to answer this question along with question 20. It is right that everyone contributes to sustainable public finances, and the government is ensuring that those with the broadest shoulders pay their fair share. Spring Budget took steps to tackle avoidance and to improve HMRC's ability to collect tax debts. This comes alongside taking millions out of paying tax altogether by consistently raising personal tax allowances and, of course, an average of over £3,300 of assistance per household in the UK for help with the cost of living over this year and last.
Daniel Zagner.
Last week, energy companies announced record profits, some £60 million a day from North Sea oil and gas. Today, the Mirror reports that some 2 million people last month were unable to pay a bill. So why on earth doesn't the government close those huge, huge holes in the levy on North Sea oil and gas profits and actually get that money to the people who need it?
I think the honourable gentleman is being quite fair in he neglects to tell the House the actual rate of levy that these companies are raising. He will understand as well why it is that we have said to businesses that want to invest to improve energy security here in the United Kingdom that we will support such investment. That has to be in our interest because, as we've heard only today, the concerns rightly raised by members of Parliament on behalf of their constituents about the cost of living and the impact particularly of energy prices.
Richard Burke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government recently announced a huge tax giveaway to the very wealthiest, allowing them to stash away vast sums in their pensions tax-free. The £1 billion annual cost for that handout would cover the cost of free school meals. When food banks gave out 1 million food parcels for children last year, why does the government think that this tax cut for the super rich is a priority?
Mr. Speaker, I gently remind him of the conversation that happened around budget, I hope he recalls, about the need to get doctors, consultants and those in the public sector back into the NHS, because we heard from doctors themselves, the BMA and others, that there were barriers in the pension tax rules at that point stopping them from continuing to serve. I am delighted if these rules help more doctors to serve our NHS, to help our constituents who are patients, and to help them continue serving this vital public service. The difference between the Conservatives on this side of the House and the honourable gentleman opposite is that we listen to people and we deliver on what we need to keep this economy going and to help our NHS.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the best ways we can ensure fairness in the tax system is to let people keep more of their hard-earned money. The Prime Minister last summer outlined a plan to see the basic rate of income tax cut to 15p in the pound by the end of the decade. Can the Minister let me know when we will see that plan outlined in detail?
Well, I do hope the honourable gentleman has been listening both to the Chancellor at Spring Budget, but also speeches and so on since then from my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, about the need for fiscal responsibility. We have to be fiscally responsible. We have acknowledged that. We've had to also make some very, very difficult decisions along the way. But we are clear that with halving inflation, tackling our debt and growing the economy, that is what will enable us to make the sorts of tax cuts that he and I both want to see so very much.
Mr. Jamesbury.
Mr. Speaker, tens of thousands of people have been affected by the loan charge, with some having faced well-documented distress and harm as a result of HMRC's approach. Yet at the same time, HMRC has been issuing fewer than 2 fines a year against the architects and enablers of failed tax avoidance schemes. It is absolutely right that the disguised remuneration schemes are tackled fairly and effectively. So how on earth can the Conservative government justify such a light-touch approach for the promoters of such schemes, whilst many of those caught up in them face such a nightmare?
Well, I would draw the honourable gentleman's attentions to the strengthening of HMRC's powers to tackle promoters of tax avoidance in both of the previous Finance Act 21 and 22, with a further tough new package of measures to ensure promoters face stronger sanctions much more quickly. These measures will raise £130 million over the next 5 years and in fact are already being used. And we have already published the details of promoters and tax avoidance schemes in order to help consumers. And we have also published HMRC stop notices because we understand we want to help taxpayers who want to do the right thing to understand which promoters and so on should be avoided.
Alex Cunningham.
Number 10, please.
Minister.
Compared to the G7, the UK had the highest rate of growth in each of the last 2 years. The IMF UK growth forecast for 2023 has been upgraded by more than any other G7 country, and the IMF has said that the UK is on the right track for economic growth.
Ms. Cunningham.
Mr. Speaker, but the British people want hope for the future, but all they see is Britain continually lagging behind on the global stage with prospects for their families getting worse. The IMF says that Britain will have a smaller economy by the end of the year, the poorest growth of the G7 over this year and next. In March, UK inflation was the highest in Western Europe, and projections show that it will be highest in the G7 this year. And food prices are rising 50% faster than in the G7. Whose fault is it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's certainly the honourable gentleman's fault if, having asked if we would do an assessment of performance across the G7, and we do precisely that, he doesn't like the answer, because the reality is that across the G7, growth has fallen and inflation has risen. But we know, Mr. Speaker, the sources of those, and it's not this government, it's the fault of Putin and the global COVID pandemic, whether they like it or not.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend is right to ignore the gloom and negativity coming from the benches opposite. They'll always find a reason to talk down the British economy, because isn't it the case that today, with more people in our country going out to work than ever before, the truth is our economy is demonstrating a dynamism and resilience that few other economies around the world can emulate, and a dynamism that you don't get with a Labour government.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and not just dynamism, but I think resilience is a strong word. And thanks to the actions that this government has taken over the last 6 months, the OBR has confirmed the UK is expected to now avoid a recession this year.
Kirstin Oswald.
Question number 12, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you. With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to answer this question with question number 17. The UK has grown faster than France and at a similar rate to Germany since leaving the single market. It remains challenging to separate the effects of Brexit and wider global trends on the UK economy, such as the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, adding pressures to trade, prices and the wider economy. We are continuing to support businesses trading with the EU, as well as helping them seize new opportunities with fast-growing economies around the world, including our free trade agreement negotiations.
Mr. Nelson.
Thank Thank you, Mr Speaker, and happy Europe Day. In recent months, we've seen tech companies attack Brexit. The world-leading chip company, ARM, opted to only float stock in the US because of how bad a place the UK is to do business. So we have culture, tourism, the NHS and now tech all suffering because of Brexit. I wonder how grateful the Minister feels that the Leader of the Opposition dropped his and his party's principles and they're still supporting this costly Brexit.
Crikey, I'm going to leave it all to the Leader of the Opposition to flip-flop his way through that particular policy. What I can tell her is that we are the best place to invest in tech in Europe. We are only the third economy in the world with a $1 trillion tech sector. We are ranked as the world's fourth most innovative economy, and we have created more unicorns than France and Germany combined.
Patrick Grady.
Unicorns and fantasies are largely what we hear from the government benches these days. The reality is that the Music Venue Trust reckons grassroots venues are closing at a rate of 1 per week. Bands from Europe find it increasingly difficult to travel here, and the hospitality sector more generally is experiencing catastrophic staff shortages. Isn't Lord Heselton right when he says that Brexit has been a classic mistake, a terrible, horrible miscalculation, and the elephant in the room of our present economic difficulties?
Hear, hear. I'm interested that the honourable gentleman dismisses these incredibly successful unicorn start-ups in the UK economy. I hope that he will not dismiss their continuing success as we continue to support them through the various tax reliefs we are offering them and investment, including through our most recent research and development tax reliefs. But I would also point out to him that, of course, Scotland itself will benefit from some 73 trade deals secured with non-EU countries, which include control of our fishing waters, something I know is a matter of great concern to Scottish residents.
We now come to Shadow Minister Pat McFadden.
Speaker, I'm never quite clear why, if we don't like trade barriers, the answer is to erect even more of them. But through the retained EU law bill, the government said it would get rid of 4,000 laws built up during our time in the EU. The Prime Minister even got his shredder out to show us what this would look like, and the government said there would be a sunset clause to make sure all this happened by the end of the year. Now, voices from both business and the trade unions have said that this could cause even more chaos and uncertainty and undermine workers' rights in breach of the promises made by ministers opposite at the time of the referendum. So after marching the troops up to the top of the hill and getting the backbenchers very excited, can the Minister confirm, is the government keeping the sunset clause to have all this done by the end of the year?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't know if I can speak on behalf of the Secretary of State for Business and Trade, who is the portfolio holder for that piece of legislation. What I do know is that the bill is currently before the House of Lords and will no doubt be scrutinised very carefully by their lordships. But what I can also reassure the House is that we are taking a careful and considered approach to the benefits, the regulations, the laws that Brexit presents to us. And we know from our discussions with businesses that business certainty is something that we all want to strive for and achieve. And I'm sure once this bill has been scrutinised by the House of Lords, members opposite.
I've got another question to come. Don't worry, you've got another chance. Pat McFadden.
Thank you, Mr. I think business certainty might be improved by an answer to the question. Mr. Speaker, inflation is 10%, the highest in the G7, and food inflation is 19%. The former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Member for Uxbridge and South Ruislip, to avoid confusion, because there are a few former Prime Ministers, promised us there will be no non-tariff barriers to trade. But we already know that many small businesses are giving up exporting to the EU altogether because of costs and delays. And now, with inflation already at these levels, this is the moment the government has picked to impose a new system for checks on EU goods, estimated to add £400 million a year to the cost of goods coming into the UK. Can the Minister tell us, why is the government picking this moment of all moments to add these new costs and price rises to UK consumers who who are already struggling to make ends meet because of the biggest cost of living crisis in decades.
Mr. Speaker, just to clarify, I was being respectful of not just this House, but the right of the other House to scrutinise legislation. I hope he would agree with that as a fine parliamentarian, as I know he is. But in terms of business certainty, what we are seeking to achieve through this legislation, but also importantly the measures that we are setting out through the Windsor framework and the arrangements at borders, is to give business exactly the certainty they need after Brexit. I think we all accept that leaving the European Union, leaving the single market, that was a generational change, a seismic change in how we wish to do business. But unlike the party opposite, we believe in Brexit, we believe in the opportunities that Brexit can provide our businesses, and that is why we are taking these measures through very, very carefully and considerately with businesses.
Abdul Khan.
Question 13, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with your permission, I should like to answer this question together with question 24. As Minister for Public Spending, I oversee the government's budgeting system, and a key element of this is incentivising departments to manage spending effectively so that value for taxpayers' money is maximised. And that's why the government launched an efficiency and savings review at Autumn Statement 22, and through the review, departments reprioritised and identified further efficiencies building on the 5% efficiency challenge set out at the Spending Review 21 to better deliver value for money for the taxpayer.
Mr. Speaker, when the Chancellor, the now Prime Minister, spent £1.3 million of public money on focus groups, including asking what the public think of him. Following the public's resounding rejection of the Tories in the last week's elections, and we now know what the public think of him. So will the government stop wasting taxpayers' money to boost the Prime Minister's ego and do the right thing and call a general election?
No.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. £7.9 billion was wasted on useless and overpriced PPE. Meanwhile, opportunists who saw the Tories coming are now profiteering on the back of the public purse. Does the Minister regret that this money was not spent wisely? Nearly £8 billion could buy us 20 new hospitals.
Thank the honourable gentleman for his question. Our priority was clear throughout the COVID crisis, and that was to get PPE to the front line as quickly as possible. And due diligence was carried out on all companies that were referred to the department. And obviously, despite all those steps being taken, some instances of fraud did occur, with unscrupulous suppliers taking advantage of the situation. This government takes that fraud seriously, and DHSC are exploring every available option to bring those who commit fraud to account. We've also made another number of other interventions, including investment in the Taxpayer Protection Task Force, to normalise higher compliance activity in HMRC, alongside other measures to deal with fraud elsewhere in some of the emergency schemes that we set up to help this economy and this country get through COVID.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Public Accounts Committee revealed that our country lost £9 billion worth of tax revenue during the pandemic because HMRC redeployed 4,000 staff members whose jobs were to chase down tax avoiders. Now, the Prime Minister was Chancellor at the time and presumably signed off this decision. So could I ask the Minister, did the Prime Minister do this as a deliberate act to give the green light to tax avoiders, or is this just another example of Tory incompetence?
Well, I think that's quite a ridiculous suggestion, to be honest. I mean, the HMRC received £863 million to modernise the tax system, and that included 136 investment over the spending period to deliver improvements in terms of a single customer record and act. Now, in terms of what happened over COVID, I've already set out the investment that we made, 100 million on Taxpayer Protection Task Force. We take fraud very seriously. And obviously now it's about HMRC looking at financial records of excessive trading to come to terms with those businesses that did use some of those schemes fraudulently, and we will continue to work on that.
We now come to topicals. Colin Lockhart. Not here. Ashley Dalton.
Number 2, Mr Speaker.
Mr Speaker, 3 of the Prime Minister's 5 priorities are economic priorities: to halve inflation this year, grow the economy and reduce debt. We're on track to halve inflation this year to ease the cost of living. We've taken the difficult but responsible decision needed to get debt falling and secure the future of public services, and we have a clear plan to grow the economy, to create better paid jobs and opportunity right across the country.
Dalton.
The Consumer Voice organisation, which has recently found that 2 million UK households missed a key payment for their mortgage, a rent loan or credit card last month alone. 700,000 of these related to housing. So when will the Tory government wake up to the fact that the cost of living crisis is far from over, and what does it intend to do about it?
Very good, Ashley. I think in previous answers, I've set out a number of interventions the government has taken to help the most vulnerable. I've mentioned the Household Support Fund, the benefits that accrue to all those who are on means-tested benefit, particularly pensioner households, those who are eligible for disability benefit. As I also said, the money that the government has made available is designed to focus on those who are most in need. And we will continue to look out for the most vulnerable through this difficult time.
Mr Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree with me that fiscal responsibility is vital if we are to cut inflation and grow the economy? And does he also agree that the Labour Party's £90 billion of unfunded spending commitments would put all of that at risk, with higher taxes and more borrowing the inevitable result?
I couldn't agree with the honourable gentleman more. Responsible public spending is at the core of getting our economy into a state where it can grow. And the 90 billion of unfunded spending pledges made by members opposite will be scrutinised very carefully, I'm sure, by many in the months ahead.
So the Chancellor Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Conservatives have now had 13 years in office. Wages lower, the weekly food shop astronomical, energy bills unprecedented, 24 Tory tax rises, and the national debt has ballooned. So can I ask, after 13 years of Conservative government, does the Minister think that people feel better off or worse off?
What I can tell the right honourable lady is that since 2010, 25% increase in the real take-home pay for workers on the national living wage, increasing recently the national living wage to £10.42 an hour, a 9.7% increase for those over the age of 23. When we came into power in 2009-10, there was a deficit of 158 billion. Before we got into COVID, it was down to 38 billion. We have gone through the most tremendous challenges that this country has seen for about 100 years. I think most people in this country understand that this government has acted on the challenges we've faced in office.
Rachel Reeves.
Mr Speaker, they've had 13 years, and the answer to the question, do people feel better off, is a resounding no. This morning I met with 22 newly elected council leaders from the Labour Party who are themselves creating emergency plans to help tackle the cost of living crisis in their communities. Why won't the Conservative government play their part, do the right thing, close the loopholes in their oil and gas tax and help working people in Britain as a Labour government would do?
Well, I congratulate those successful across the country in last week's elections. But what I would also say is that what business leaders want and what the country wants is steady policy making, delivering growth in the economy, dealing with the biggest scourge on the economy, which is inflation. The Right Honourable Lady says from a sedentary position that we've had 13 years. We've also spent 400 billion where we had a global pandemic, and when we came out of it, where we had to shut down the economy. When we came out of it, we had high inflation consequential of a war that we hadn't had in Europe for over 70 years. Those are the realities, and that's what this government has responded to.
Foster.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Regenerating our town centres was a key part of the local election campaign in Torbay. Would my right honourable friend meet me, my honourable friend for Totnes and the new leadership of Torbay Council to discuss what further fiscal steps can be taken to support these aims?
I'm always very happy to meet my honourable friend. I would like to congratulate him on his leadership of his council candidates last week and the excellent result that he secured. And of course, we've invested in many coastal communities across the country, and I'm very keen to discuss specifics around how the government can support him as he drives that local constituency and economy forward.
John Warren. Mr. Speaker, today, manufacturing body Make UK warned the government that to tackle regional inequalities and compete on a national stage, we need a national industrial strategy as a matter of urgency. Do the ministers recognise that the reason that wages in the North East are falling under the Tories is their lack of an industrial strategy and their failure to follow Labour's example and commit to a modern industrial strategy that invests in the industries of the future and delivers good quality jobs across our country?
No, I don't recognise that characterisation. What I recognise is a government that's determined to see the economy grow. I see investment in investment zones focused in her region, working with the excellent universities that she's familiar with. I see a government that's putting 100 million into Foundation Models Task Force, 900 million to invest in supercomputer, to fund AI, and a quantum strategy which is generally seen as world leading, as well as 160 million of investment in the tech sector. So this is a government that is committed to the growth industries of the future.
Jane Hunt.
University Hospitals of Leicester was pleased to hear that they are to receive £400 million for a new hospital, but I understand the money is still with the Treasury. Please can my honourable friend confirm that when UHL will receive their £400 million, and whether it might be increased to account for construction cost rises?
I thank the honourable lady for her question. And of course, delivery of new hospital infrastructure and prioritisation within health budgets is a matter for the Department of Health and Social Care. But I know from frequent conversations with the Secretary of State that he's working tirelessly to ensure as many new hospitals as possible and wider improvements to the health estate can occur. And I shall make representations to him after this session.
Thank you. It's reported in the press today that prior to any investment, BP and Equinor saw written guarantees that assets at the Teesworks site hadn't been acquired as a result of, and I quote, an unacceptable act, and that directors, and I quote, will not hide or dissimulate the nature, origin, location, disposition or ownership of assets, rights or values. It's just extraordinary. Given the importance of this free port to investment and jobs in Teesside, can the Treasury confirm if it too has made any similar checks?
I'm very sorry, I can't answer that question, but I'm happy to meet with the honourable gentleman to look at the very serious matter that he's raised and get an answer for him.
Fuller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chief Secretary knows that the much long-hidden business case for East West Rail will represent a bad deal for taxpayers. He will know that MPs from across Parliament have written about greener, better alternatives for growth in the Oxcam Arc. And he will know that on Thursday the Conservatives won the mayoralty in Bedford for the first time because the Conservative candidate Tom Wootton called for a review of Bedford Council working and their support for East West Rail. So will my right honourable friend meet with me to discuss this further urgently?
I'd be very happy to meet with him, and I also congratulate the Mayor of his hometown of Bedford for the success that he had last week.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Falling pretty short of where it needs to be if we're actually going to tackle net zero. There was some recent research by E3G and WWF, the Worldwide Fund for Nature, around clean investment. The gap is currently between 81 and 111 billion between now and 2030. That's the equivalent of a quarter of the investment required in this crucial economic sector and every other sector of the economy. Public investment, Mr. Speaker, clearly needs to be a key driver in reaching net zero. So I wonder if the ministers can answer if they will consider increasing the capacity of UK infrastructure banking on that.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the government is leading the way with the recently published Green Finance Strategy, but that stands as part of a broader piece of work, unleashing productive finance into all parts of the economy and, in particular, funding the transition, which is very capital intensive.
Luke Evans.
For 2 weeks ago, meeting with Leicestershire MPs and the senior leadership of the County Council to discuss funding there. Particular concern is around core funding of SEND, social care and transport like buses. So what more can he do to address the County Council funding problems we have in Leicestershire?
Well, I know my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, welcomed that meeting on the 25th of April. The Government remains committed to improving the local government finance landscape, and in doing so, the Government will work closely with local partners, including Leicestershire, and take stock of the challenges and opportunities across the sector. I'd like to thank him for his deep thinking into how improvements can be made.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Why is the Prime Minister and Government Ministers so keen to protect non-dom status while not investing sufficiently in our NHS as Labour would do?
Well, the honourable gentleman, I hope, knows that we are spending record amounts on the NHS. We are also mindful that non-DOMs pay some £7.9 billion on UK taxes on their UK earnings and have invested some £6 billion since 2012. And so we are mindful of the very, very real impact they make on our revenues. But we have managed to tighten the rules around non-dom status. And Mr. Speaker, that's why.
No, it's not all right. Jonathan Gullis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Day one on the job, and Stoke-on-Trent Labour talked about cancelling the £56 million of levelling up funding, which is UK leading to the great city of Stoke-on-Trent. Will the Chief Secretary of the Treasury confirm the Conservative government is going to have the backs of the people of Stoke-on-Trent and deliver this important levelling up?
We're very committed to the people of Stoke-on-Trent and recognise the enormous investment thanks to his work in campaigning for investment through the Levelling Up Fund. And it's down to the Council now to deliver on that significant investment and make a difference on the ground.
Dave Dugan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The transition to net zero should be the overarching priority for all of us. So, with that in mind, when will the Treasury finally get its act together with the ACON project in the north east of Scotland and accelerate that funding to make sure that the people of the north east of Scotland don't just have to listen to the warm words about a just transition, they can get a job in the just transition?
Well, I think we've made commitments on the first phase, and the Chancellor is considering matters further in terms of the next steps, and he will update the House in due course.
Diana Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, the Financial Times today is reporting that there have been meetings between the Treasury and the Department of Health about compensation for those who were victims of the infected blood inquiry. I wondered whether the Minister might be able to confirm that those meetings have taken place, who was present, and offer reassurance to those who were infected and affected that compensation, as Sir Brian has recommended, will be implemented in full.
I believe the Minister for the Cabinet Office updated the House a couple of weeks ago on this matter, and I'm sure he'll be keen to do so again when those conversations have taken place.
Mr. Speaker, this morning before I left my Livingston constituency, I attended a rally by Hands Off Howden Park and Save Our Pools, two incredible campaigns in my constituency that are trying to protect our arts venues and our pools from closing. Unfortunately, they have been mismanaged by the Labour and Conservative administration. However, there is also the reality to be faced that a decade and a half of austerity has decimated public funding. So when will this government stop wasting money on things like Brexit and nuclear weapons and properly fund our pools and our arts venues?
Well, we don't make decisions typically from Whitehall on specific decisions around local authorities. What we have committed to is significant additional funds for local authorities and funding to Scotland Government through the Barnett formula. I would leave her to continue to lobby and campaign with her constituents to get those decisions made on the ground.
That completes the questions. I'll let the chamber clear before we start the urgent question. Right, we now come to the urgent question. Joanna Chorry.
Mr. Speaker, to ask the Secretary of State for the Home Department if she will make a statement on the policing of protests during the coronation.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the coronation was a once-in-a-generation moment. A moment of national pride. A moment when the eyes of the world were upon us. A ceremony with roots over a millennium old, marking a renewed dedication to service by His Majesty the King in this new reign. Mr. Speaker, the coronation went smoothly and without disruption. I thank the 11,500 police officers on duty, alongside 6,500 military personnel and many civilians. Commissioner Mark Rowley today outlined the intelligence picture in the hours leading up to the coronation. This intelligence picture included more than one plot to cause severe disruption by placing activated rape alarms in the path of horses to induce a stampede, and a separate plot to douse participants in the procession with paint. This was the context: a once-in-a-generation national moment facing specific intelligence threats about multiple, well-organised plots to disrupt it. The police's focus was rightly on ensuring this momentous occasion passed safely and without major disruption. That was successful. All the plots to disrupt the coronation were foiled by a combination of intelligence work and proactive, vigilant policing on the ground. I would like to thank and congratulate the police for this success. At the same time, extensive planning ensured protests could take place. This was also successful. Hundreds of protesters exercised their right to peaceful protest, including a large group numbering in the hundreds in and around Trafalgar Square. Now, where the police reasonably believed they had grounds for arrest, they acted. The latest information is that 64 arrests were made. I won't comment on individual cases or specific decisions, but the arrests included a person wanted for sexual offences, people equipped to commit criminal damage with large quantities of paint, and arrests on suspicion of conspiracy to cause public nuisance, often backed by intelligence. The Met's update last night included regret, to use their word, that 6 people arrested couldn't join the hundreds protesting in Trafalgar Square and nearby. The Met has confirmed those 6 people have now had their bail cancelled with no further action. Mr. Speaker, the police are operationally independent, and for the Met, it is primarily for the Mayor of London to hold them to account. But let's be clear. At the weekend, officers had to make difficult judgments in fast time, in a highly pressured situation against a threatening intelligence picture. I thank the police for doing that, for delivering a successful coronation, and for enabling safe, peaceful protests.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Saturday, millions of people greatly enjoyed the coronation ceremony. Others who wish to see a republic chose to protest peacefully, as is their right in a democratic society. Protests in Glasgow and Edinburgh went off without incident. However, in London, protesters who had gone to considerable lengths to liaise with the Metropolitan Police in advance of their protests and to clear both the nature and the location of the protest were detained, searched, arrested and held in the cells from 7 a.m. till after 11 p.m. All 6 of those arrested have now received letters saying there will be no further action taken against them. There were a number of other arrests of concern, but because there is no legal proceedings in respect of the 6, and therefore no reason for Parliament not to begin today to address what happened to them, I'm going to focus on them. Graham Smith, the leader of the group Republic, tells me that the arresting police showed absolutely no interest in contacting the liaison team and seemed focused on luggage straps holding placards together, which they said might be used to lock on. The Joint Committee on Human Rights has repeatedly stressed that public authorities, including the police, are under a negative obligation not to interfere with the right to protest unlawfully, and a positive obligation to facilitate peaceful protest. So why did police arrest protesters who'd gone to such great lengths to clear their protest in advance, and why did they do so on grounds which they now admit are not sufficient to charge them and without following up with the liaison team? What do citizens need to do now to clear a protest in advance? On the BBC Radio 4 Today programme, Sir Peter Fahey, the former Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police, said what had happened has to be seen in the context of media, political and public pressure on the police. He referred to what he called, quotes, some pretty direct and personal feedback brought to bear on Sir Mark Rowley before the Home Affairs Select Committee on 26 April by the Honourable Member for Ashfield, and I have notified him that I had mentioned him, Mr Speaker. So, was political pressure brought to bear on the police? Sir Peter also said that the legislation, the Public Order Bill and the Policing Act is very poorly defined and far too broad, and that is what opposition MPs warned of, particularly regarding offences like locking on. So will he review the legislation and set up an inquiry into what happened to these 6 citizens on Saturday?
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable and learned member for her question. I have the greatest respect for her and will take her questions seriously. She asked about pressure. The police are, of course, operationally independent and make these decisions independently of government. Government ministers did receive a briefing, particularly as the intelligence picture escalated in the 24 hours prior to the event. But the Mayor of London also received briefings, as I understand did the Shadow Home Secretary, I believe, on Friday. So there is nothing out of the ordinary in ministers receiving briefings, not least because there is a need to coordinate between the police and other agencies, both security agencies and other civilian agencies as well. In terms of legislation, this House has just debated and scrutinised at some length the legislation, and there is no plans to change that. In relation to the 6 people who were arrested and the question of protest more generally, I will just repeat the point, Mr Speaker, I made in my initial answer, that I think hundreds of people did exercise their peaceful right to protest. It was done, as the Honourable and learned lady said, following engagement with the Republic protest group in advance, and the fact that hundreds of people were able to peacefully protest, I think, is testament to the rights of peaceful protest. In relation to those 6 people, I don't want to get into the details of that because, frankly, neither she nor I have all the facts, but clearly, at the point the arrest was made, the police reasonably believed there were grounds to do so. But I emphasise again, for hundreds, I think several hundreds of people on that day, they were able to peacefully protest, as is their absolute right.
David Davis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Nobody should question that this was a difficult time for the Metropolitan Police, a difficult task to achieve. And nobody should question that, in a large respect, they carried it out brilliantly and gave us a marvellous occasion this weekend. That being said, within 1 week of the Public Order Bill entering the law and in its first serious use, we end up with the head of the Met having to apologise to people who were wrongfully arrested. In the event that, let us say, the Home Affairs Select Committee reviews this matter and comes back with recommendations as to how we change guidelines and maybe laws, will the Home Office take it on board?
Well, I would just caution my right honourable friend against asserting these people were wrongfully arrested. That is not an assertion that has been. That is a legal threshold, and I don't think it's been established that that legal threshold has been met. I would also, in terms of testing this legislation, I would also just draw the House's attention to the fact this was a once-in-a-lifetime event, and it took place against an intelligence backdrop which suggested there were multiple well-organised plots to cause very serious disruption, which, if they had proceeded, would have been taken very seriously by this House and been seen around the world. So I don't think one can infer from what happened at the weekend that the recently passed legislation is defective.
Now comes Shadow Minister Sarah Jones.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The coronation of King Charles III involved the largest police effort ever undertaken. I want to thank the thousands of police officers who ensured so many people were able to enjoy such a historic occasion without incident. Rightly, in our democracy, those police had operational responsibility and had to take decisions at pace and under pressure. And rightly, in our democracy, we also have scrutiny and accountability where problems arise. Hundreds of people who chose to do so were able to protest, and as the Minister stated, some plans to disrupt were foiled. But serious concerns have been raised about some of the arrests. The 6 people from Republic were arrested under new powers in the Public Order Act, being equipped for locking on, which came into force 2 days before the coronation. They have now been released with no further action, and the Met has expressed regret. Mr. Speaker, the Minister knows that I have warned him and his colleagues repeatedly that this new power means that people might be arrested for the wrong thing, carrying a bike lock in their bag, or, as happened in this case, some luggage straps. Many former police officers have warned that these powers put the police in a difficult position and risk undermining the notion of policing by consent. These arrests raise questions that we do want answers to. Why the arresting officers didn't know or take account that Republic had been working with the police, or why they were held for 16 hours. Does the Minister support the review by the Mayor of London so Parliament can see lessons to be learnt? And on the new public order powers, will he ask the Inspectorate and the College of Policing to monitor and review them and report back to Parliament? And will he support the recommendations in the Inspector's report for more specific training for our officers on public order? This weekend was a celebration, and one that could not have happened without the dedication of our police service. But just as important to our British democracy as our constitutional monarchy is our historic model of policing by consent, trust, and our freedom to peacefully protest. It is our job as members of Parliament to come up with laws that solve problems, not create them. So I urge the Minister opposite to learn the lessons and take responsibility for protecting that careful balance between the police and the people.
Well, look, I think it is important to maintain the balance as the Shadow Minister sets out. But as I pointed out in my opening response and my subsequent one to the honourable member opposite, the right to protest was, for those hundreds of people, protected. The protests did happen. And indeed, there is no question in principle or in any legislation that the right to peaceful protest is sacrosanct. We have, of course, in recent months seen that right to peaceful protest being stretched into acts that are deliberately disruptive, where people have sought to close down the M25, they've sought to close down the streets of London, not so much as an act of protest, but to deliberately inconvenience the public, and that is where we draw the line. At the weekend, that is broadly the same test that was being applied. Peaceful protest, of course, absolutely fine. Activity that was designed to seriously disrupt the coronation, including potentially causing a stampede of horses or covering the ceremonial procession in paint, was not acceptable. The police had to make difficult judgment. This is a unique situation. I think it probably can agree it is pretty unique. They had to make very difficult decisions in very fast time against an extremely threatening intelligence picture. Often the facts were, at the time, unclear. That is very difficult. I think all of us here should just accept those are difficult decisions. And I think the police, obviously, it's for them to answer operationally, but they, if they were here, would say they acted lawfully to the best of their reasonable belief at the time. But I do want to put on record the right to peaceful protest is sacrosanct, and I'm sure no one in this House on either side would ever seek to undermine it.
Michael Ellis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Would the Minister agree with me that as a matter of law, the fact of the matter is that the police are entirely within their rights to arrest individuals to prevent a crime? It happens somewhere in the country pretty much every day. They obviously do not have to wait until a crime is actually committed, the active offence is committed, before acting. If they knew an armed robbery was about to take place from intelligence received, they don't have to wait until that armed robbery is taking place before acting, and the same applies here. Does the Minister agree with me that the police did an excellent job in very difficult circumstances, and this is a government that supports the police? We will leave the opposition parties to support those who do not follow the law. And the fact of the matter is, in extremely difficult circumstances, they did a good job.
Oh, can I just remind you, you're not at the bar now. You've got shorter questions. Come on, Minister.
Look, I thank my right honourable and learned friend for his question. Yes, I do agree the police did a good job in what were very difficult, fast-moving circumstances where judgments were inevitably difficult. It is easy to criticise after the event, but I think the police did a good job in what were extremely trying and difficult circumstances.
SNP spokesperson Anderson Douglas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The UN Commissioner for Human Rights has said that the Public Order Act is incompatible with the right to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association. It is deeply disappointing to hear Labour and the Conservatives now both wedded to this legislation that undermines our right to protest. Graham Smith, the CEO of Republic, has said that these arrests are a direct attack on our democracy and the fundamental rights of every person in the country. He further says the right to protest peacefully in the UK no longer exists. Instead, we have a freedom to protest that is contingent on the political decisions made by ministers and senior police officers. That is entirely unacceptable. And in reading Sir Mark Rowley's statement that he has put out, he says, having reviewed the evidence and potential lines of inquiry, we do not judge that we will be able to prove criminal intent beyond all reasonable doubt. So these arrests were not necessary. And further, Sir Mark Rowley says he supports the officer's actions in this unique, fast-moving operational context, which means that if similar circumstances occurred, there is no certainty that this would not just happen again. So will the Minister tell me further what protections people can expect when they, in good faith, engage with authorities before protest to prevent this kind of thing happening, to find it happen again? And is he concerned that a journalist was amongst those arrested?
Well, it is entirely inaccurate to say the right to protest does not exist. As I pointed out, hundreds and hundreds of people did peacefully and lawfully protest on Coronation Day. They did so unmolested and unimpeded, which I think goes to show this idea that the right to protest doesn't exist, it doesn't exist anymore, is absolute nonsense. What does not exist is the right to cause disruption to other members of society. That is what our laws seek to prevent. And in relation to the Human Rights Act, and particularly Articles 10 and 11 of the ECHR, the recent Public Order Act had a Section 19(1)A statement on the front of it, saying that legal analysis finds it is compatible. And if the Honourable Lady studies Articles 10 and 11, and particularly the second paragraphs of those, she will see they are balanced rights, balanced with the qualified rights, which are able to be balanced against the right of democratically elected legislatures to legislate to prevent criminal activity, including disruption.
James Dale.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that the Metropolitan Police did a great job here? They took the necessary action to protect the public during a unique state event, and not one word of what we've heard opposite or anything that's going to come will be able to give any evidence to the country in respect of that. It is reassuring that for once the Metropolitan Police acted on the side of the hard-working public who want to have the opportunity to enjoy events rather than being the victims of left-wing protest groups.
I agree with my honourable friend.
Chair of the Select Committee, Dame Diana Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, and can I add my thanks to those involved in the arrangements for the coronation and keeping the public safe. However, I think the Home Affairs Select Committee will no doubt want to look at the policing of protests at the coronation, and in particular the specific provisions in the Public Order Act brought in just last week and used to arrest members of Republic. We've heard a lot about operational independence of the police this afternoon, so can the Minister just explain why the Home Office's Police Powers Unit on the 27th of April sent an official letter to Republic ahead of the coronation? Now, of course, Republic have no history of locking on. I just want to know how many other organisations received these letters, what other groups received them, and on what basis they were sent these letters, and whether this practice will now be the norm for the Home Office.
Minister.
Well, any such letters, I don't believe, were sent in my name, so I can't comment on who may have received them. I suspect, although I'm not certain, that these related to clarifying the new statutory provisions that were recently brought into effect through the Public Order Act 2023. The operational independence of the police is important because Parliament legislates, and it is then for the police to apply those laws without fear or favour, and they did so on this occasion.
Sir Desmond Swain.
There's been a misunderstanding, clearly. Despite the police doing a brilliant job, that's why there's been an apology. But wouldn't the Minister expect that misunderstanding to have been resolved well within the 16 hours for which the 6 were incarcerated? And surely there should be some questions asked about that.
Well, again, exactly what happened is an operational matter for the police. Clearly, on that day, Saturday just gone, the police had a lot going on in central London, policing the largest public event that we have ever had in our country's history. I don't know, and in fact no member of this House knows or can know precisely what inquiries were being undertaken while the decision ultimately to release those individuals was taken. But of course there are complaint processes available. If any individual member of the public wants to follow them, they're available to anyone who is arrested or indeed who encounters the police. And if someone feels the police have behaved in a particular situation unreasonably, they are able to use those complaint procedures.
Richard Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Isn't it the case that the arrests we saw of peaceful protesters at the weekend weren't an aberration, but were exactly what the Public Order Act is designed to do, to clamp down on legitimate peaceful protest, which should be a basic democratic right in this country?
No, that is not the purpose of the Public Order Act. The Public Order Act is designed to prevent people deliberately disrupting the daily lives of their fellow citizens, which we have seen with locking on public highways, causing enormous traffic jams, stopping people getting to hospital, stopping people getting their children to school, people being unable to get to work. We've seen 10-mile tailbacks on the M25, and we had specific intelligence that people planned to disrupt the coronation by creating a stampede of horses and covering the ceremonial procession in paint. The Public Order Act 2023 is designed to stop that kind of disruption, while of course allowing peaceful protest. That is its purpose.
Louis French.
Mr. Speaker, and I feel, given some of the heat of the debate, I must add that as a Greater London MP, it's complete and utter nonsense that you can no longer peacefully protest in London. I myself attended my first ever protest a couple of weeks ago, where I was protesting against the Mayor of London's disgraceful ULEZ, and we were left to peacefully protest. But does my honourable friend agree that the police and our armed forces, those 11,500 police officers and armed forces, did an excellent job over the weekends to police and keep the public safe during the fantastic coronation celebrations?
Well, look, I think my honourable friend puts it very well. I join him, by the way, in opposing Sadiq Khan's appalling ULEZ idea. But on the coronation policing, yes, they did a great job. I think there were almost 30,000 officers deployed at one time or another during the relevant period between the Met Force area and Thames Valley for the Windsor concert the following day. There were, I think, 11,500 deployed on the day of the coronation itself, in addition to 6,500 armed forces personnel. We also, by the way, had 312 protected people coming into the country from around the world. And we had, I think, almost 1,000 close protection officers deployed as well. All of those officers did a fantastic job in what was, I think, a moment of national pride for all of us.
Mr. Carmichael.
Mr. Speaker, can I just say to the Policing Minister, I'm a little bit surprised that he should apparently accept without question the proposition that the Metropolitan Police now apologises to people who have been lawfully arrested. Even by his standards, that's something of a novel departure. But the Public Order Act has given police officers very broad and sweeping powers, which in turn requires the police to exercise discretion and judgment with no context or guidelines. And as a consequence, if there is no change to this legislation, things like this will keep happening. There should have been better pre-legislative scrutiny of this Act. There wasn't. Will he now commit to giving us post-legislative scrutiny of it?
Well, I mean, of course, many pieces of legislation require on-the-ground interpretation, whether by the police or subsequently by the courts in case law. Indeed, the precise definitions contained in this new piece of legislation, the Public Order Act 2023, include things like much more precise definitions of what constitutes serious disruption, which was previously extremely ambiguous. And that clarity is something which the police and others had called for. In terms of scrutiny, obviously the House is welcome to conduct scrutiny whenever it wants. I think as a matter of standard, new bits of legislation are subject to post-leg scrutiny sometime later. But actually in many areas, this new Act of Parliament, recently taken effect or recently gained royal assent, provides additional specificity, clarity and precision that was previously lacking.
Michael Public.
The Minister said rightly that hundreds of people protested against the once-in-a-generation coronation. Hundreds of thousands of people were present to actually celebrate the coronation, while millions in the United Kingdom and around the world watched it. I'm getting pretty fed up, actually, with the police apologising all the time. I can say that ordinary police officers doing a decent job, as they did on Saturday, find their morale is at rock bottom when they're given the instruction, "We will deal robustly with anyone intent on undermining this celebration," which came from the Met Police on the 3rd of May, and then finding that someone is apologising for them doing just that.
Well, I think the Metropolitan Police Commissioner had an article in today's Evening Standard which very robustly sets out the background and defends the police's approach to the coronation. And in fact, if any member of the House has not yet read that Evening Standard article, I think it was published earlier today, and I'd strongly recommend members on both sides to read it. I think the comment he refers to specifically was an expression of regret that those 6 people were unable to join the hundreds of others who were peacefully protesting. Now, the hundreds of others were exercising their right to peaceful protest, as they are perfectly entitled to do, but it is worth mentioning in passing, as my honourable friend has just done, they were in a tiny, tiny, tiny minority, but that does not in any way undermine their right to protest if they choose to.
Clive Lewis.
Mr. Speaker, I think it looks terribly obvious to anyone that looks at this that if you take a piece of draconian legislation like the Public Order Bill, pass it through, rush it through this place via an unelected head of state who gave it consent, hand it to a failing institution like the Metropolitan Police, who then decapitate the leadership of the Republican protest movement. What do you expect? This piece of legislation is doing exactly what it says on the tin. It's stopping peaceful protest.
That is absolute nonsense. This legislation is preventing disruption to the lives of our fellow citizens. I wholly repudiate the suggestion it was rushed through. There was extensive ping-pong, which I do not recall the honourable gentleman turning up to if he was so concerned about scrutiny. And as for his comment about the process for a bill gaining royal assent, I will not dignify that with a response.
John Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Personally, I can't think of almost a greater waste of time in an inquiry into this. I think the police did a fantastic job over the weekend. I think they took actions under pressure. They had to make decisions quickly to ensure that a great national event went ahead without any kind of negative event, and that was true, and I'm very glad that happened. Does the Minister agree, share with me some of the concerns that some of the Just Stop All process think they might have found a bit of a loophole in the Public Order Act and actually think they can get away with slow marching? Will the Minister assure me this isn't the case and that we don't continue to see Just Stop All protests cause havoc in our towns?
Well, Just Stop Oil have adapted their tactics since they blocked the M25 back in, I think, November and caused 10-mile tailbacks, following which a number of arrests were made, some of whom were, in fact, then remanded into custody. They have now changed their tactics with these slow-walking tactics, but the police are now applying cumulative disruption tests to that, using Section 12 of the 1986 Public Order Act, and they are making notices under that Act, and recent disruptions in the last sort of 10 to 14 days have seen the roads cleared typically within less than 10 minutes, which I'm sure Londoners, my constituents and others will welcome very strongly.
Caroline Lucas.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister just said that the right to peaceful protest is sacrosanct and that no one would seek to undermine it. But I would put it to him that that is exactly and precisely what his government has just done. Ministers are criminalising protest. And just because some people were allowed to go ahead and protest does not mitigate against the fact that a number of them were not. And if I could just correct the Minister, those who were arrested and kept in were not causing an obstruction, which is presumably exactly why the police then went to apologise to them afterwards. So doesn't this show that the powers the government has handed to the police are dangerously broad, liable to gross misuse, as many of us have pointed out? And can I urge him again to urgently review this piece of legislation?
No, I don't accept that analysis. The powers are designed to prevent disruption where it might occur or where it is occurring. That includes things like locking on, which we have seen cause huge disruption on the streets of London. The law allows peaceful protest where it's not disruptive and where people do not plan to cause disruption, and that is why hundreds and hundreds of people, albeit a tiny minority of the total, were able to peacefully protest. Where someone is preparing to commit or is committing a criminal offence, like disrupting a procession, it is reasonable for the police to act.
John MacDonald.
As the Secretary of the NUJ Parliamentary Group, throughout the passage of the public order legislation, I asked for and was given by ministers assurances that this legislation would not impede upon journalistic freedoms. And yet on Saturday we saw at least one journalist stopped and searched, nothing found, handcuffed, his credentials torn off him, and then detained for 16 hours, a member of BEC2, a professional filmmaker. Could I ask the Minister now to investigate why the assurances this House was given on media freedom were not adhered to?
Minister.
Yeah, well, the new bill does contain a specific clause which was, I think, added during its passage, protecting journalistic freedoms. I think if there is and in fact, there was an incident in Hertfordshire a few months ago, I think it was in November, when a journalist was incorrectly arrested and the relevant police force, Hertfordshire in that case, apologised subsequently. The government did then legislate in the recent bill. As I say, there is a specific clause protecting journalistic freedom. I don't want to comment on an individual operational matter, not least because neither he nor I have the full facts, but as I said already, there is a complaints process, and if an individual or others feel they weren't fairly or properly treated, they do have a complaints process they can go through. But Parliament has made its view clear.
Alan Dorrans.
Mr. Speaker, good afternoon. Does the Minister agree with the former Greater Manchester Police Chief Sapir Fahy, who has extensive experience of public order policing, who previously described the Public Order Act as poorly defined and far too broad, and who added this weekend that we are now seeing the consequences of that?
Minister.
No, I don't agree, and I've already explained why.
Nadia Whittam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister has repeatedly used the example of hundreds being able to protest as evidence that our right to protest isn't undermined. But when people can be preemptively arrested on the flimsiest of pretences and then be thrown in a police cell for the best part of 24 hours, how can he reassure people who are attending a protest or even walking near a protest that the same thing won't happen to them? How can he claim that our right to protest isn't being undermined by his government?
Minister.
Well, I've mentioned the ECHR compatibility, particularly in relation to Articles 10 and 11. Before the police can arrest anyone, they do have to have a reasonable grounds for suspicion that an offence has been committed. Obviously, individual operational decisions, in this case relating to 6 people, are something that can be looked into subsequently if that is necessary. But the bill itself, the Public Order Bill, as passed by Parliament, does nothing to criminalise lawful protest. And as I've said, hundreds and hundreds of people did exercise exactly that right, although they were in a tiny minority.
Justin Mathers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's no doubt the police have a difficult job to do, making swift on-the-ground judgments, but I think that their job is made harder when they don't act in a consistent manner. Now, I've had an eyewitness account that a protester was allowed to go in amongst the Republicans for about 10 minutes unchallenged, jostling them, acting in a provocative manner, right in front of the police before the police actually intervened. There's no doubt that was disruption, but the police didn't act for quite a long time there. So does he agree that actually that sort of thing creates the impression that some types of protest are more equal than others?
Yeah. Well, I haven't heard that particular account before, so I don't think it's really appropriate to comment on something I've just heard about across the floor of the chamber. But I've already drawn the House's attention to the procedures that are available to members of the public. But I do appreciate his opening comment that the police did have a very difficult job. They were under enormous pressure. They were dealing with a number of intelligence threats that I outlined at the beginning of my response. Things were moving very quickly. Often the picture was confusing. And things had to be done often in a rush. So I do appreciate his acknowledgement of the very difficult job the police had to do, but I think they rose to the occasion.
Wendy Chim.
you, Mr Speaker. Now, I voted against this bill and legislation at every stage, but as a former police officer from Bill Committee stage onwards, I highlighted training, the capacity and capability of police officers to be able to exercise their powers so that those dynamic pressures that the Minister just referred to can actually be dealt with appropriately. So can the Minister advise how many officers were trained in relation to this legislation prior to attending the coronation on Tuesday? How many of them, at what rank, and what does the training consist of?
Well, obviously, many officers do have specialist public order training. The overall gold commander for the event is one of the Metropolitan Police's most experienced public order commanders at the rank of commander. Many officers have had specialist public order training, as I say, in the course of their career. But it is important to make sure that, particularly as legislation changes, the training keeps up with it. And I know the College of Policing and others will be issuing the relevant guidance to make sure that is addressed.
Johnson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does the Minister agree with me that the Metropolitan Police's admission of regret regarding their arrest of 6 anti-monarchy protesters this weekend is an admission of guilt? And does he accept that this is a chilling violation of basic democratic rights and demonstrates beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Public Order Act should be immediately repealed?
No, I don't agree.
Kirsty Oswald.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I think that the Minister has a real brass neck. The Tory government have brought in this most draconian legislation, and then he's in here telling us that the police are operationally independent of the government, as if it's absolutely nothing to do with their actions. The Human Rights Watch have said that what we saw was something that you'd expect to see in Moscow, not London. And I wonder if he would agree with me that given that only reportedly 6% of those who were arrested for protesting against the coronation were actually charged with anything at all, that this new legislation is absolutely nothing but an advert for how to impede people's right to protest.
Well, I must say, with great respect, I think that is nonsense. And comparing the policing of the coronation with Putin's Moscow or Putin's Russia, where opposition figures are incarcerated, people like Alexei Navalny in prison, suffering the most appalling and inhumane treatment. I think it's, frankly, a bit of an insult to the appalling treatment they are suffering to in any way compare what is happening there to the policing of the coronation. I don't think it is at all respectful to those being oppressed in Russia at all. And in terms of peaceful protest, hundreds of people did peacefully protest against the monarchy. It was a tiny minority, but they did protest. The police only made those arrests, 64 arrests in total, where they had reasonable grounds to believe a criminal offence had been committed or was in preparation. And if anyone feels that the arrest they experienced wasn't proper or appropriate, there are mechanisms they can use to complain and to seek redress.
Mr
Speaker, I appreciate this was an exceptionally challenging weekend for the police, but I'm particularly concerned about the arrest and detention of members of the Westminster Night Stars team, who are volunteers out in central London helping to keep people safe. Now, communication between local authorities and the police and other agencies is absolutely critical. So can the Minister assure me that he will find out what happened, what went wrong in this communication, and to be sure that lessons are learnt to make sure that when volunteers were out supporting the police in their work, they do not get arrested because of a breakdown in such communication?
Minister.
Yes, I think that is a matter which, first of all, I agree with her that the communication between local authorities and police is very important, and that join-up needs to happen. I think the question she has asked is probably best directed via the Police and Crime Commissioner for the Mayor of London, who I'm sure will be happy to take up the query.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. No one wished the new Commissioner of the Met success more than London MPs whose constituents had suffered from a catalogue of institutional harm under his predecessors. But his statement in the Standard today is political somersaulting from start to finish, including justifying arrests because celebrating crowds were applauding and cheering them. Isn't this a direct result of the undue pressure put on the Commissioner by a Conservative Party that increasingly picks and chooses when it follows the rule of law?
Minister. Well, I don't accept that. I've already pointed out the operational independence of the police, and I've also said that briefings by the Met on the coronation were received not just by Home Office ministers, but also by the Shadow Home Secretary and by the Mayor of London, all of which was completely proper.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The whole world could see on Saturday the effects of this public order legislation on policing trying to prevent legitimate peaceful protest in a democracy. Will he reply in a considered and reasonable way of an undertaking to undertake a full review of the operations of the public order bill thus far on preventing peaceful protest in this country as an example of how democracy is prepared to admit it's got something wrong and is prepared to change it?
No, what we saw on Saturday was the police doing their best in very difficult and challenging circumstances to prevent disruption occurring while allowing and facilitating peaceful protest, which indeed went ahead and happened.
Douglas Chapman.
Mr. Speaker, there's an unwritten law in Scotland where the best policing is carried out when it's done with the consent of the public. What is it about the Met that, when it comes to public events, the policing is heavy-handed and often completely wrong in its tone? Would the Minister agree with me that when such an approach becomes part of the policing approach, does that not undermine public confidence in the police itself? And will he review urgently basic training needs at the Met? And does this government diktat through the public order bill, does that not get in the way of good policing?
Look, I mean, training is very important, as his honourable friend mentioned a little while ago. But once again, I don't think what we saw was an unreasonable or indeed any trampling on the right to protest. We saw hundreds of people exercising their right to protest. But I would also just urge the House to keep in mind this was a unique event. This was a once-in-a-generation event. The eyes of the world were upon us. There were numerous intelligence reports that I was briefed on, and perhaps the Shadow Home Secretary was briefed on as well, indicating well-developed plots to disrupt the coronation, and the policing response to this needs to be considered in that context.
Beth Winter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following the arrests of peaceful pro-democracy campaigners on the route to the coronation on Saturday, the Security Ministers claimed that the weekend would, and I quote, "showcase our liberty has fallen flat." Can the Minister please explain why it was the Home Office and not the Metropolitan Police who wrote what protest groups have referred to as intimidatory letters about the public order powers? And can he please provide a comprehensive explanation as to why journalists are now being arrested when Section 17 of the Public Order Act prohibits this?
Yeah, well, on the question of the letters, as I said earlier, those were not sent, as far as I can recall, in my name. They may well have been attempting to be helpful by clarifying recently enacted legislation which some groups may not have been familiar with, and it's not unreasonable to try and make sure relevant parties do know when the law changes. In relation to journalistic freedom, as she says, this House and the government, supported by the government, voted to particularly and specifically protect journalists, and that is the right thing to do. If anyone feels that hasn't been properly implemented, there are complaints procedures available.
Daisy Cooper.
Mr. Speaker, amongst those arrested on Saturday was Rich Felgate, a documentary filmmaker who identified himself as a journalist, claims that a police officer ripped off his press credentials before he was then arrested and detained. The Minister will know that Rich was one of 4 journalists and filmmakers who were arrested and detained in or near my constituency in Hertfordshire last November. It is incomprehensible to me that after the outcry last November, police forces can still keep getting the basics wrong when it comes to protecting the freedom of the press and the right of journalists to do their jobs. So will the Minister look again at this legislation, and will he please consider again the proposal for a statutory duty on police to facilitate peaceful protest and the proposal for a code of conduct so the police and the protesters know where they stand?
Well, as I've said 2 or 3 times already, the new Public Order Act does contain a clause, I think the honourable member opposite suggested a moment ago, it was clause 17, which specifically protects journalistic freedom. If there are, and that of course followed the incident in Hertfordshire, it was after the incident in Hertfordshire, if there are particular examples, particular individual cases where the new law and indeed the wider ECHR right and common law right for journalists is not being applied, there are complaints mechanisms, but this House, supported by the government, has legislated specifically to protect journalistic freedoms.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. Given
what happened to these 6 individuals on Saturday who were clearly not involved in any plot to use rape alarms or paint to disrupt the coronation. Otherwise, why have the police apologised to them? What confidence can the organisers of any future protests have that what they have been told in advance planning meetings with the police will actually be capable of being relied upon on the day?
Well, I believe, again, without wanting to go into too many specifics, I believe the police's assessment at the time didn't relate in this particular case to rape alarms or to paint, but to locking on equipment. The right honourable member opposite says it is clear, but of course many things are clear with hindsight. Things are sometimes less clear in the heat of a live operation. In terms of assurance around the right to protest, the Public Order Act does not in any way infringe or undermine the right to protest, and indeed we saw on Saturday quite a reasonable-sized, a few hundred people protesting at the coronation event without any impediment, and we see Just Stop Oil protesters these days protesting on an almost daily basis. So there is evidence in front of us showing us how the right to protest unfolds on a near daily basis.
Brendan O'Hara.
On Saturday, we saw Metropolitan Police officers pre-arresting people whose only offence was to want an elected head of state. Despite their planned peaceful protest being pre-authorised, UK citizens who had committed no crime whatsoever were taken off the streets and detained simply because of their political beliefs. But isn't this exactly how this anti-democratic, draconian, authoritarian piece of legislation was designed to work? And isn't it proof, Minister, that this is what makes this legislation so dangerously wrong?
Minister.
No, the legislation does not in any way criminalise or prevent protests. We see protests happening on a daily basis, including on Saturday. What the legislation does is enables the police to prevent disruption. They need to have a reasonable belief in order to do that. If anyone feels that in this very small minority of cases, tiny minority of cases, those powers were misapplied, then there are complaints procedures. But the vast, vast, vast majority of people wishing to protest on Saturday did so.
Carol Monaghan.
Deputy Speaker, can the Minister confirm whether the right to peaceful protest only applies if the individual's views chime with the government's own?
Minister.
I mean, I'm not really sure that question merits an answer. I mean, legislation is clearly politics agnostic, and it's for the police to apply it without fear or favour.
Mick Whitley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does the Minister accept that the troubling scenes witnessed during the coronation vindicate that those of us on this side of the House who own the government's new anti-process laws would be used to stifle dissent and limit freedom of expression? And will he accept that if we are to protect the most fundamental rights of free speech, then the Public Order Bill must be scrapped in its entirety?
No, as I've said repeatedly, the Public Order Act and associated legislation is designed to prevent disruption to our fellow citizens' day-to-day lives while enabling peaceful protest.
Martin Doherty Hughes.
Let me congratulate the member for Edinburgh South West for actually gaining this urgent question today, Madam Deputy Speaker. The seemingly random nature with which the Metropolitan Police can apply the law only to fully exonerate those arrested soon after is itself akin to something one might see in an illiberal democracy like Hungary or Turkey. And all this just a week after the Security Minister themselves stood at the dispatch box there and said that the coronation was a chance to showcase our liberty. So does the Minister agree with their colleague? Are these arrests a showcase of British liberty?
Minister.
Well, I think the fact that hundreds of people protested against the monarchy, albeit they were a tiny, tiny minority of the crowd, demonstrates the right to protest is unfettered. The fact that I suspect as we speak there are Just Stop Oil protesters somewhere in London, no doubt up to their protesting activities as we have this discussion here in Parliament. So I think the right to protest is sacrosanct. It is protected, not least by the ECHR, but also by our domestic legislation. That is something we should all be pleased about.
Peter Grant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister has repeatedly told us today that there was evidence of, in his words, a well-developed plot
to misuse activated rape alarms in a way that would clearly have been criminally reckless and which no one could condone. Given that that plot was so well developed, and with the exception of the 3 Night Stars volunteers that have been referred to already, can the Minister tell us, of all the people arrested, how many of them were found to be in possession of rape alarms? How many of them have been charged with intent to use those rape alarms for criminal purposes? How many rape alarms have been seized on Saturday? And if the answer to all of those questions is nil or next to nil, will the Minister accept that in this case the police intelligence was badly and dangerously misinformed?
No, well, I think there is an update on all of the arrests on the Metropolitan Police's website, which will provide some of the information the honourable gentleman asks for. Some arrests were made on the ceremonial, close to the ceremonial footprint, including people that had large quantities of paint. Other arrests were made at locations away from the ceremonial footprint at what might be described as a safe house. The briefings that certainly I received from the Met the night before, and I believe the Mayor of London received, and possibly the Shadow Home Secretary as well, I'm not sure, indicated multiple well-developed and credible plots to materially disrupt the coronation, and I think it is greatly to the Metropolitan Police's credit that they prevented those from unfolding.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Participating as I have in protests across Northern Ireland, all peaceful protests in the politics of Northern Ireland, I think I recognise that government is trying to ensure that peaceful protests can take place. The coronation weekend has been a globally celebrated event, and something that the United Kingdom will look back over many years to come with pride. And the 64 arrests that were made were in relation to, I understand, intelligence that suggested that there would be deliberate attempts to cause nuisance on Coronation Day. Will the Minister join me in thanking the Met Police, as opposed to critiquing them for carrying out their duties in a swift manner, to enable people to celebrate the coronation of His Majesty the King in peace and without disruption?
Minister.
Yes, I would like to join my honourable friend in thanking the police and the armed forces personnel and the civilians involved in laying on the coronation for a successful and ultimately peaceful event, despite the plots that were uncovered in advance. I'd like to, also thank the police for ensuring that those protests were able to take place. It's an event, I think, overall, that this country can be proud of. I'm sure all of us want to wish King Charles III well at the beginning of his new reign and say, God save the King.
Well, I thank the Minister for answering the urgent question. We now have statement, Secretary of State for Health.
Madam Deputy Speaker, with permission, I would like to make a statement on the primary care recovery plan. For most of us, general practice is our front door to the NHS. In the last 6 months, over half the UK population has used GP services, and GPs in England carry out around 1 million appointments every single day. They're doing more than ever. General practice is delivering 10% more appointments a month than before the pandemic, the equivalent of the average GP surgery seeing about 20 additional patients every working day. There are more staff than ever, with numbers up by a quarter since 2019, and we are on track to deliver our manifesto target with an additional 25,000 staff already recruited into primary care. And we are investing more than ever too, with the most recent figures showing that funding was around a fifth higher than 5 years before, even once inflation is taken into account. But we know there is a great deal still to do, and COVID-19 presented many challenges across the health service, leaving us with large numbers of people on NHS waiting lists which need to be tackled. In general practice, patient contacts with GPs have increased between 20 and 40% since before the pandemic. As well as recovering from the pandemic, we face longer-term challenges too. Since 2010, the number of people in England aged 70 and above has increased by a third. And this group attends 5 times more GP appointments than young people. Not only that, advances in technology and treatments mean that people understandably expect more from primary care systems. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, today I can announce our primary care recovery plan, and I pay tribute to my honourable friend, the member for Harborough, for his work on this plan. And I have deposited copies of the plan in the libraries of both houses. Our plan will enable us to better recover from the pandemic, to cut NHS waiting lists and to make the most of the opportunities ahead by focusing on 3 key areas. First, tackling the 8 AM rush by giving GPs new digital tools. Second, freeing up GP appointments by funding pharmacists to do more with a pharmacy-first approach. And third, providing more GP staff and more appointments. NHS England and my department have committed to make over 1.2 billion of funding available to support the plan, in addition to the significant real terms increases in spending on general practice in recent years. And taken together, our plan will make it easier for people to get the help that they need. Madam Deputy Speaker, the plan builds on lots of other important work. Last year we launched the elective recovery plan, which is making big strides to reduce the backlog brought by COVID-19. And we eliminated nearly all waits over 2 years by last July. And now 18-month waits have decreased by over 90% since their peak in September 2021. And by contrast, Madam Deputy Speaker, in the NHS in Labour-run Wales, people are twice as likely to be waiting for treatment than in England. They still have over 41,000 people waiting over 2 years and nearly 80,000 waiting over 18 months. In addition, this January it came before the House to launch our urgent and emergency care plan, focused on how to better manage pressures in emergency departments with funding to support discharge to improve patient flow within hospitals. And so today's plan is the next important piece of work. Madam Deputy Speaker, turning to the detail of the plan. Our first aim is to tackle the ATM rush, and we will do this by providing GPs with new and better technology, moving us from an analogue approach to ways of working in the digital age. An average-sized GP practice will get around 100 calls in the first hour of a Monday morning, but no team of receptionists, no matter how hard-working, can handle such demand. About half of GPs are still on old analogue phones, meaning that when things get busy, people will get engaged tones. So we're changing this by investing in modern phone systems for all GPs, including features such as callback options, and by improving the digital front door for even more patients. In those GPs that have already adopted these systems, there has been a 30% improvement in patient feedback on their ability to access the appointments that they need. And this also reflects the fact that online requests can help find the right person within the practice, such as being directed to a pharmacist for a medicine prescription review or to a physio for back pain. In doing so, we will make the most of the 25,000 more staff we now have in primary care. Today's plans fund practices without this technology to adopt it, whilst also providing them with staff cover to help them manage a smooth transition onto this technology. Indeed, many small GP practices in particular find it hardest to fund new technology or to manage the disruption that comes with transitioning to new ways of working. So we are funding locum cover alongside the tech itself. Notwithstanding, Madam Deputy Speaker, people will always be able to walk in or ring in if they'd prefer. And if someone wants to ring up and see someone face to face, these investments make that easier too. We'll also want to make sure patients know how their request is going to be handled on the same day that they make contact. Clinically urgent issues will be assessed on the same day or the next day if raised in the afternoon, and if not urgent, an appointment will be scheduled within 2 weeks. But crucially, Madam Deputy Speaker, people won't be asked to call back tomorrow. Instead, they'll get their appointment booked in the same day or be signposted to other services. Turning to the second area of this plan, and pharmacy first. As well as giving GPs new technology, I know we need to take off pressure from GPs where possible by making better use of the skills of all clinicians working in primary care. We saw the incredible role pharmacists played during the pandemic, their capacity to innovate and deliver for their communities that they served, and to free up GP appointments in doing so. So the second part of our plan is to introduce a new NHS service, Pharmacy First, on which we are already consulting with the Pharmaceutical Services Negotiating Committee. 80% of people live within a 20-minute walk of a pharmacy, so making it easier for pharmacists to take referrals can have a huge impact. Referrals might be from GPs, NHS 111, or from next week from urgent and emergency care settings. Community pharmacists already take referrals from a range of minor conditions such as diarrhoea, vomiting and conjunctivitis. But with our Pharmacy First approach, we can go further still. We will invest up to £645 million over the next 2 years, so pharmacists can supply prescription-only medicines for common conditions, like ear pain, UTIs and sore throats, without requiring a prescription from a GP. One of the most significant shifts we're making is on oral contraception. Pharmacists can already manage the supply of contraception prescribed elsewhere, and from later this year, they will also be able to start women on courses of oral contraception. And this is another way which we aim to reduce the barriers to women accessing contraception in light of our women's health strategy. Pharmacists will also be able to do more blood pressure checks, which is one of the most important risk factors for cardiovascular disease. Not only will these kinds of steps make it easier for people to get the care they need, we expect it to release up to 10 million appointments a year by 2024-25. Madam Deputy Speaker, the third part of our plan is about providing more staff and more appointments. We're making huge investments in our primary care workforce and are on track to meet the manifesto commitment of having 26,000 more primary care staff by next March, meaning we have more pharmacists, physios and paramedics delivering appointments in primary care than ever before. In 2021, we hit our target of 4,000 people accepting GP training places, and our upcoming NHS workforce plan will set out how we'll further expand GP training. And we're also helping to retain senior GPs by reforming pension rules and lifting 9,000 GPs out of annual tax changes. These are the pension reforms that the BMA welcomed, describing them as significant and decisive changes and citing them as transformative for the NHS. As well as freeing up more staff time, our plan cuts bureaucracy too, so GPs spend less time on paperwork and more time caring for patients by removing unnecessary targets, improving communication between GPs and hospitals, and reducing the amount of non-GP work GPs are being asked to do. For example, patients are often discharged from hospital without fit notes, meaning they then have to go to their GP to get one. By the end of this year, NHS secondary care services, who will understand those patient conditions better, will be able to issue fit notes. And we've streamlined the number of targets on primary care networks from 36 down to just 5. Taken together, this work will free up around £37,000 per practice. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, today's primary care recovery plan funds and empowers our GPs and pharmacists to do more, so we can prevent ill health, keep cutting NHS waiting lists, and improve that vital front door to the NHS for many millions of people. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Secretary of State for Health, Wes Streeting.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement too. Madam Deputy Speaker, this announcement was meant to be the Prime Minister's relaunch after he received a drubbing in the local elections, and unfortunately for the members opposite, it seems the Prime Minister is bouncing back in true Alan Partridge style. Having read that Downing Street has drawn up plans for a health-focused mini-relaunch, I eagerly tuned into the radio this morning to hear the Health Minister. And what was the Conservatives' message to the public this morning following their worst defeat since 1997? They are breaking their manifesto commitment to recruit 6,000 new GPs. Once again, the Conservatives have overpromised and under-delivered. And I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, he just admitted to missing his target to eliminate the 18-month waits by April. Is that the second broken promise of the day? It's hard to keep up. As a result, millions of patients wait a month to see a GP if they can get an appointment at all, waiting in pain and discomfort, unable to go about their normal lives. This is the price patients are paying every day for 13 years of Conservative failure. And the Prime Minister has no idea what it is like to be most people in this country. Right. He is completely out of touch with what NHS patients are going through, and that's why he can't offer the change the country is desperately crying out for. The Health Secretary has called this announcement the GP Access Recovery Plan. What is this a plan to recover from, if not his party's appalling record of underinvestment and failure to reform? And does he now regret the 2,000 GPs cut since 2015, the 350 GP practices which have closed in the same time, and the 670 community pharmacies which have shut up shop on their watch? And isn't expecting the Conservatives to fix the NHS after they broke it, just like expecting an arsonist to put out the fire they started. It is just not going to happen. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's not just the voters turning to the Labour Party for answers, it's the government too. In January, we set out our plans for the future of primary care, including allowing pharmacists to prescribe for common conditions, opening up self-referral routes into things like physiotherapy, and ending the 8 a.m. scramble. Sound familiar? The problem is that's where the similarities end, because what the Conservatives offer today is a pale imitation of Labour's reform agenda. Where is the plan to give patients real choice? There is nothing on enabling patients to see the same doctor each appointment. Doctors themselves tell us continuity of care is important. Nothing on allowing patients to choose whether they're seen face-to-face or over the phone, merely the promise of better hold music and the invention of things like callback, which has existed for many years. In fact, where is the plan for better mental health support, more care in the community and in people's homes, more health visitors to give children a healthy start in life? Or have all of these issues been dumped into a box marked too difficult? And, Madam Deputy Speaker, he says patients will get an appointment within 2 weeks as if it's some kind of triumph. 2 weeks. When we were in government, we delivered GP appointments within 2 days. And when will this pitiful promise be delivered? There's no date or deadline. When can patients expect the 8 a.m. scramble to be ended by? There is no date or deadline. When will patients with urgent needs be seen on the same day? There is no date or deadline. In fact, I wrote to the Minister and asked him how many patients are currently not seen on the same day. He said he didn't know. The department doesn't hold that information. So what is the point of these pledges if they don't know whether they are being met? The document also says the NHS and his department have, and I quote, retargeted over £1 billion to pay for the announcements, but not where that money has come from. So where has he cut the NHS services in order to pay for these announcements? And his plans for patients to refer themselves to physios for back pain by bypassing GPs could lead to 5,000 cancer patients missing their diagnosis. That was according to, perhaps he remembers, that's right, the Conservative Party back in February, and 3 months later it's their policy. So perhaps the Secretary of State can clarify, was the Conservative Party telling porkies back in February, or does he simply not know what on earth he is doing? And given this is meant to be a primary care recovery plan, where's dentistry? Where is it? NHS dentists are in even shorter supply than Conservative council leaders. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, let me turn to the supermassive black hole at the heart of today's announcement. Where is the plan to train the doctors and nurses the NHS is so desperately short of? Labour has set out our plan to train 7,500 more doctors and 10,000 more nurses each year, paid for by abolishing the non-dom tax status. So when will he finally admit he doesn't have any ideas of his own and adopt Labour's plan? After 13 years, Madam Deputy Speaker, they have no plan to give the NHS the staff it needs. They have broken their promise to recruit 6,000 new GPs, and they have missed a golden opportunity to give patients real choice. Only Labour has a plan to rebuild and renew the NHS, and that is why people across the country are coming home to Labour.
Secretary of State.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, he started with the message to the public, and the message to the public can be seen by what key figures within the sector themselves say about this recovery plan. So let me just share with the House that the Pharmaceutical Services Negotiating Committee says that it is, and I quote, the most significant investment in community pharmacy in well over a decade. The Boots chief executive says that this is, quotes, great news that they'll be able to use their clinical expertise more widely. The Company Chemist Association says that, and quotes, it's a real vote of confidence for the future of the profession. So the point is, the message to the public is clear from the industries in this sector that this is a well thought through plan that will have a beneficial impact for patients. And I give one final quote, the Royal Pharmaceutical Society, where the chair says this will be a, quote, real game changer for patients. And that is what our focus, Madam Deputy Speaker, has been. He also raises the issue of our delivery against the 18 months target. It's very generous of him to give me the opportunity to once again share with the House the contrast with Wales. Perhaps he missed it first time round. We have reduced the wait for 18 months by over 90%, and yet in Wales they still have vastly more, over 80,000 waiting over there, and that's on a much smaller population. They still in Wales have over 40,000 waiting more than 2 years, a target we virtually eliminated as long ago by the summer. So for those who want to see what a Labour government would mean for the NHS, they can see it with the performance against the 2-year waiting list and the 18-month waiting list in Wales. So it's very generous of him to give me the opportunity to share that once again with the House. He talks about what the recovery plan is for. Well, clearly the pandemic has placed huge pressure on primary care, and we can see that just from the increased volumes of appointments that primary care faces. Again, I touched in my opening remarks on the fact that GPs and primary care are seeing more than 10% more appointments than before the pandemic. 1 million appointments a day. And so it's clear why we need to invest in new forms of working, online booking technology, cutting bureaucracy, in order that the GPs can focus on those aspects of their role that apply purely to GPs, and we can better use the 25,000 additional roles that are being recruited into primary care. He talks about his direct referral policy. We actually announced our policy guidance in December, a month before he came out with his announcement. So just in terms of sheer chronology, it is clear that an announcement that comes a month after the planning guidance is issued is something of a stretch, Madam Deputy Speaker, to say that we were in some way following his own approach. He raises, once again, very kindly, the issue of mental health, which gives me an opportunity once again, Madam Deputy Speaker, to remind the House of the increased funding this government is making in mental health. It was a key priority of Prime Minister May. It was a key cornerstone of the long-term plan, with an extra £2.3 billion of funding going into mental health. But we did not stop there. The Chancellor at the budget further prioritised mental health. For example, mental health digital apps was a key cornerstone of the measures in terms of economically inactive people. And of course, part of our additional 25,000 roles in primary care is recognising that specialists are needed, whether it's physios, whether it's pharmacists, whether it's paramedics, and included within that is the role for specialists around mental health support. He talked more widely around other aspects of primary care, dentistry. Well, we have frequently said we have a recovery plan for dentistry that we will announce shortly, so that should not be news. And finally, in terms of funding, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's slightly bizarre, isn't it, that this plan announces new funding for primary care, over £1 billion of new funding, investing in tech, investing in new ways of working, investing in additional staff, investing in empowering our pharmacists who bring great clinical expertise that we can better harness. And rather than welcoming that, he goes back to the hackneyed non-dom funding that we've heard so much before, which has been spent so many times. What we have set out is ways of best using the skills of our GPs, best using the skills of the additional recruits where we're delivering on our manifesto with an extra 25,000 already recruited, and above all, best using our pharmacists which is a huge resource which we can better use. That's why we're targeting over 600 million of additional funding into our pharmacists, which will allow people to better access the care they need in a timely fashion.
Chair of the Health Select Committee, Steve Barclay.
Deputy Speaker, I do welcome the plan, which I note the government have released at the first possible moment after the local election period. The Select Committee members and myself, we will study it carefully, and I know the Primary Care Minister has already agreed to come before us so we can give it a good going over. My question is one of timing, though, Madam Deputy Speaker. How quickly can the telephone, the investment in that 8 a.m. scramble part of the policy make a difference to those practices that don't have it? And I noticed he said that they were already negotiating with the Pharmaceutical Services Negotiating Committee. So how quickly can that very, very welcome new investment get to the front line of community pharmacy?
Well, the short answer, Madam Deputy Speaker, is this year, but he's absolutely right, as Chair of the Health Select Committee, to focus with all recovery plans on deliverability. I hope he will take comfort from the fact that around half of GP practices already have cloud telephony, which is why we're so confident that it is the right approach, it is one that is already working, and we're seeing in the response from patients the positive feedback that online booking, callback systems are things that patients themselves hugely value, but also that allows primary care to better triage calls to the specialists and therefore to use the additional roles that we recruited in a more optimum way. So it will be rolled out this year, but it is already up and running and we can see that it's working.
Dame Margaret Hodge.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to take the Minister out of the bubble of Westminster and the green benches into the reality of what's happening on the ground in my constituency. We've got the second highest number of A&E attendances for minor injuries, people who should be going to their GP. We're the most under-doctored and second most under-nursed area in North East London. And just under 9% of patients last year could see their GP within 14 days of requesting an appointment. So for me, the recovery plan announced today is deeply underwhelming, and I hope he can answer these 3 questions. When will he not plan, but when will he deliver the 6,000 extra GPs that had promised? What work is he doing to move GPs from working part-time to putting more hours into working at the front line with their patients? And where is the commitment to deliver face-to-face appointments for those that want it in my constituency? Only when I have answers to those questions will I feel confident that there really is a plan for the GP services in Barking and Dagenham.
Yeah. Well, I know the Right Honourable Lady very well, having served with her for 4 years on her committee. So I hope she won't mind me just slightly being surprised as someone who lives in the Fens, being told that I'm in the bubble, as opposed to as someone who doesn't live in London. But in terms of her points, we've obviously got 37,000 more doctors than when the government came to power. But directly, it is the changes to pensions that lifts around 9,000 GPs out of the tax changes. It is training more, so 4,000 compared to 2,600 as it was in 2014, so we're on track in terms of the number we're training. It's the additional roles that we're funding, the 25,000 on target for our manifesto or commitment of 26,000. But also, it's the pharmacy announcement is all about freeing up GP capacity for the face-to-face appointments for those who want to come in, by enabling those who want to get oral contraception, to want to have a blood pressure test, to want to access the 7 common conditions such as UTIs, ear infections for which prescriptions can then be given. That pharmacy capability will then free up GP time for the face-to-face appointments. And if you look at last year's patient survey, around 2/5 of patients hugely valued continuity of care and face-to-face, which also means about 3/5 actually preferred to prioritise speed of access rather than seeing the same GP or seeing so face-to-face. So it's about tailoring the offer to what the patient wants. The patient don't always want the same thing. Some want speed, and pharmacies can deliver that.
Jackie Doyle-Price.
Madam Deputy Speaker. Could I congratulate my right honourable friend for his announcement with regard to pharmacy? It's something that I've been calling for a number of years. This is a massively skilled body of medical professionals. We ought to be making more use of them, particularly to free up GPs. And for many people, they are the front door to the NHS more than the GP's surgery is. But can I ask him to confirm that for the additional work that they will be doing to support NHS, they will get some reward?
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy. And first, can I commend my honourable friend, because I know this is an issue she herself has championed, and she's right to do so, because these are degree-qualified clinical roles. That is why it is sensible that we make far better use of the skills they offer. We saw during COVID just how much value they offer to their communities. I can confirm they will be paid for these roles. That is what the additional funding is all about. But she's been right to highlight over the years the importance of pharmacies and what they can offer, and that is what this announcement is all about.
Clive Betts.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. First, I want to thank the GPs in my constituency and their staff for the job they're doing for my constituents under the most enormous pressure. And I want particularly to include their receptionists in that for the online service, the upfront service that they do give, with particular pressure on them. But what GPs, often in their 50s, are saying to me is they want to leave, they want to give up, not because of pensions, but because of the overbearing workload they have and the incredible centralisation and red tape coming from NHS England at national level. And then they look for new GPs coming through, and they see so many trainees, qualified doctors now, going off to Canada, New Zealand, Australia, because the terms and conditions of work are better there. So when are we going to see from the Secretary of State the workforce plan that has been promised over and over again, previously supported by the now Chancellor as chair of the committee? When are we going to see that plan to deliver the amount of training we need and then the efforts to retain GPs we already have?
Well, first, can I agree with him and thank him? He's absolutely right to recognise the huge amount of work of GPs and their staff, including receptionists, and that is why the recovery plan is very much targeted at recognising the workload. I flagged in my statement the additional volume of patients that a typical GP surgery is seeing, and that indeed reflects that huge amount of work that is done. I do think pensions was a factor, certainly in the feedback that we had from the profession that was raised, and the changes that the Chancellor announced take around 9,000 GPs out of those tax changes. But he's right, it wasn't the only factor, and workload was also part of that. And again, what the recovery plan does is look to cut bureaucracy. It reduces the targets, as I say, down to 5, but it also looks at area where there are appointments which we don't feel are necessary. So from secondary care, looking at how they can do fit notes, for example, rather than someone needing to go to the GP in order to get that. There are areas where we can streamline the workload of GPs, and that is what the recovery plan does. In terms of the workforce plan, we've said on a number of occasions post-PERDA we will set that out very shortly, and we'll have more to say on that in due course.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I join the honourable member for Sheffield, inviting him to thank all our GPs for their incredible work. Can I very much welcome his statement and ask in particular about the Pharmacy First plan? Will that enable places like Harwich and Dovercourt in my constituency to increase the out-of-hours cover that pharmacies provide? Otherwise people have to travel miles just to get a prescription. And can I ask also where all these new GP staff are going to be put? Because most GPs have very cramped premises. West Mersey surgery in my constituency has been trying to develop new premises for a long time, unsuccessfully, and because the GP's partners won't take the risk. And there are premises in Harwich at the Mayflower surgery where there is empty space in the building rented by the NHS from a failed Labour PFI project, but the GPs themselves can't afford to pay that rent, so they sit empty but still paid for by the taxpayer. What are we going to do about that?
Well, firstly, again, I join with him in paying tribute to the work that his GPs in his constituency do, as they do elsewhere. In terms of pharmacists, part of the reason for this investment is to support pharmacy, including in rural settings. And obviously, the more funding going in, the more they can prescribe, the more things that they're able to do, the better the business model. And of course, there are more pharmacists than previously, and there are more still pharmacy shops than there were when in 2010. So there are more, but it's important we make the business model more viable, and that's what the announcement does. In terms of the estates plan, and that is an issue for each integrated care board to look at. I'm very happy if there's a specific issue locally in terms of a former PFI and how that is being used. That's not a new issue. I remember on the Honourable Ladies, Right Honourable Ladies Committee looking at many a Labour PFI where the regional fire control centres were a case in point where the estate could no longer be afforded and the space was empty. So if there's an issue like that, I'm very happy to look at that in due course.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Pharmacy and as a pharmacist myself, I would say that this is a step in the right direction. However, speaking to many pharmacists and many within the sector, we believe that in order for this policy to unleash the full potential of pharmacy, there needs to be a proper investment in the workforce plan, because what we're seeing is pharmacists are leaving community pharmacists who can prescribe and going into other sectors. So it's great that we've got the prescribing abilities, but if these pharmacists are not there, then the full potential can't be unleashed. Secondly, we are seeing we have a funding crisis with many pharmacies closing, so this has to be accompanied by further funding and steps to address the medicine supply chain. Just wanted to ask the Minister if you could clarify a few things. Whether or not pharmacists will be paid competitively for their prescribing skills, because previously in other government announcements that hasn't been the case. So we've got pharmacists who would like to feel valued from this announcement. And also will this announcement be followed by actual support for premises as well? Because, you know, I'm sure the Minister is aware that pharmacists do have challenges, for example, having access to the patient's record, but also actually having the workforce needed for them to take the time out to go out and speak to patients. And will the Minister meet with me and APPG to discuss this issue further? Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, first, can I thank her for recognising constructively that this is a step in the right direction, as she said, and I think it is something, as the quotes from the sector show, that is very welcomed by many working within pharmacy. As I said a moment ago, there are more pharmacists. There's 25,000 more than in 2010. But of course, the additional funding, including directly to her question, including for prescribing, will make the business model more viable and therefore support the workforce within the pharmacy sector. On her point of IT, that is something that we're working on as part of the recovery plan, and there's a big read across into the NHS app and how we better empower patients, both in terms of their access to their own medical records, but also so that they can find the right services, including being directed from the NHS app to pharmacies.
Thank you. Through.
Today's announcement, which undoubtedly will widen access to primary care services. However, will my right honourable friend consider investing in point-of-care diagnostic testing in pharmacies and GP surgeries to speed up the diagnostic pathway and in turn help reduce NHS waiting times?
My honourable friend raises a great point. It's one I'm extremely keen on in terms of how we improve diagnostic testing, how we make it more accessible, because as she knows from her time in the department, early treatment is more effective, but it is also more cost effective. And therefore, how we look at more home testing, more testing at pharmacy, more work with employers to accelerate early detection. I think there's both a win in terms of patient outcomes, but there's also a win in terms of delivering care in a more affordable way.
Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Liberal Democrats and many others in this House have called for a pharmacy-first approach for a long time, but there do appear to be two major problems with this announcement today. The first is that the government's own plan says the money for it is going to be retargeted, so I'd be grateful to know from the Minister which other service will miss out. And in my own constituency, 2 pharmacies have already closed, and across England we know that 16% of pharmacies have said that they don't think their pharmacy will survive another year. So could the Minister tell us, how does he expect people to access a pharmacy first if their pharmacies continue to close?
Well, as I said earlier in my statement, there are more pharmacists than in 2010, and there are more people working within the pharmacy sector. the numbers have gone up, 24,000, again, more pharmacists than 2010. So there are more to address the second part of her question. In terms of the first part and funding, as I said in my statement, this is new funding for primary care. And that is the commitment we made, and that is why it should be something that's so welcome within the primary care sector.
Bob Seeley.
I welcome very much the statement. And I noticed the difference in opinion opposite between people who know what they're talking about and people who don't. When it comes to pharmacy first, I think it's a brilliant idea. Well, thank you for the Secretary of State. And I know, and I very much hope it's going to be welcomed by pharmacies in my patch. I just want to reiterate some of the points being made, that some of my pharmacies feel they've been under a lot of financial pressure recently. Will the financial package be able to support them and make them feel valued, considering what extraordinary good value for money they are? And secondary, related to that, will there be any financial support or grants being made available to pharmacies, especially the smaller ones, in some of my rural and small towns, so that they can actually invest money or get a grant to get a patient room, get a room to see patients, so they can take advantage of this great Pharmacy First scheme? Thank you.
Well, firstly, can I welcome my honourable friend's comments. And in terms of the funding, there's 645 million over the next 2 years, which is to support this expansion through Pharmacy First. In terms of the estates programme, that is, as I said a moment ago, more of an issue for the Integrated Care Board. It is not the case that we should try and determine all these decisions on estates from Westminster. It is right that we let the 42 ICBs have more discretion over what is the right estates strategy within their area, but I'm sure his local ICB will hear the representations that he makes.
Sir Chris Bryant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Of course, I completely support the idea of pharmacists being able to do more. It makes more sense, for instance, if you have shingles, to be able to go to a pharmacist today to be able to get retrovirals prescribed. But my fear is that what's been announced today doesn't really fully understand the crisis that there is in primary healthcare. I mean, if you just look at the numbers given by the government's own ministers, in September 2015 we had 29,364 fully qualified GPs in England. Last September, we had 27,556. By the government's own numbers, that's 2,000 fewer. And also, if you take community pharmacies, we've gone from 11,949 in 2015 to 11,026, so nearly 10% fall. I just wonder, don't we need to do more to really enthuse people to work in our NHS across the whole of the primary healthcare? Would it be a good idea to change the model for GPs, to have more salaried GPs?
Well, again, just on the numbers, as I've touched on a few times now, but to give him the precise numbers, 335 more pharmacists than there were in 2010, so the idea that there's fewer is simply not the case. In terms of doctors in general practice, there's 2,000 more, and of course we've got the extra 25,000 additional roles. And as I say, if someone wants to go and see someone for a prescription review, then it's right that they go and see a pharmacist. If they've got back pain, it's right that they go and see a physio. Not everything has to go through the GP, and what is better is that we actually use the GP's time much more effectively. And we've got more doctors in training, 4,000 in training in primary care compared to 2,600 in 2014. So there's more staff, more effort on recruitment, more effort on retention through the pension changes, and also better use of the additional roles.
Dr Caroline Johnson.
Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome that the government is looking at how it can best support GPs and how it can improve access to primary care. But I wonder how will these plans both protect and enhance the role of GPs who dispense in their own practices? How will he protect against their antibiotic resistance concerns? And how will he solve the root cause of this problem, which is not enough general practitioners?
Well, first, on the first point, it won't make changes to them. On the second point, in terms of prescribing, then that is part of the consultation. And part of looking at that is learning the lessons from elsewhere. Obviously, Pharmacy First is already up and running in Scotland in many respects, but looking at what tests can be done alongside those prescribing rights so that the prescription in terms of antimicrobial resistance is effectively targeted.
Seema Malhotra.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the steps in this statement are reflective of what Labour has called for and are well overdue. And I'm glad to see at least we've got some steps going forward, but it's falling well short of the scale of the challenge that we face. Pharmacists need to work in a strong primary care environment, and we do need to see more GPs, increase primary care services, more test diagnosis, minor procedures that are done in the community, speeding up care and taking the pressure off secondary care. And this is why I met with ministers in his department and officials 3 years ago to seek advice and support for the rebuilding of the rundown Heston Health Centre in my constituency. Could he advise me as to what the government's strategy is to support the rebuilding of rundown primary care facilities, to support the recruitment and the retention of GPs, but also the much better facilitated work between GPs, pharmacies and other community healthcare?
Well, there does seem to be a slightly confused response, because part of the challenge from the opposition bench is to say they're not happy with this announcement, and then at the same time to say it's part of Labour's plan or it's a step in the right direction. So I think just got to make the mind up as to which it is. But in terms of the estates, as we said in 2 earlier responses, it is for the integrated care boards to have an estate strategy within their area. The decision on estates shouldn't all be set centrally. One of the changes we are making centrally is to embrace much more modern methods of construction and a more modular approach. The unit cost of that is far cheaper, the delivery confidence and therefore contingency is much lower. The confidence is higher, the contingency cost is much lower. So we are changing how we build our estate, but the estate strategy is an issue for the ICB.
Michael Fabricant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the Honourable Lady opposite will know, it takes 5 years to get a Master of Pharmacy degree and to become fully qualified. And continued training goes on as pharmacists continue in their work. So this is a very valuable resource, and I welcome the statement. My honourable friend, my right honourable friend, will know that in France, for example, where it costs €26.50 to see a GP, most people would choose to see a pharmacist first. But my question is this. By taking pressure off general practices, is he sure that he's not going to overwhelm pharmacists like mine in Lichfield and Burntwood?
Well, firstly, my honourable friend quite rightly draws to the practice in other countries and the fact that actually patients are very willing and happy to go to pharmacists where that is more appropriate for the treatment that they're using, and that is what the Pharmacy First strategy is all about, and learning the lessons from that, whilst also thinking about some of the risks around antimicrobial resistance and making sure we mitigate around that. In terms of the impact on pharmacy, I just refer my right honourable friend to the quotes from the sector, and this is something that the sector themselves have called for, that they have welcomed, and it responds very much to discussions that we have had where pharmacists themselves have said they can do more, they're keen to do more, but they needed the funding to go with that, and that is what Pharmacy First delivers.
Rachel Gaskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The impact of the announcement today will be minuscule compared to the scale of the challenge facing primary care right now. In York, our GPs are innovating and they're ambitious, far more ambitious than the Secretary of State, to bring real change in the way that whole pathways operate. In the light of that, will there be additional money available for innovation within primary care so that GPs can lead the challenge and lead the change that's needed?
Well, there is funding in other parts of the department budget, not least around tech innovation, the work that we're doing on artificial intelligence, for example, the scope on demand management to use AI much more to relieve pressure on GPs, to look at changes in behaviour, for example, of frail elderly patients and pick up changes early through the use of AI. So there is significant opportunity. There's questions as to how we better use data, and that poses challenges, I think, across the House in terms of how we better use data to manage pressure within primary care. So there is funding elsewhere within the department's budget in addition to what is announced here.
Paul Bristow.
Deputy Speaker, I'm pleased to inform the House that my mother has moved in with my wife and I. Indeed, from my right honourable friend's constituency. One of the joys of living with my mother is helping her with Tesco orders, Amazon deliveries, and of course serving what she calls the interweb. And I'm looking forward to teaching her or helping her with the new NHS app. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that many more people using the NHS app, including Mrs Bristow, and many more services available on the NHS app, is more convenient for patients and will free up GP time to do what they should be doing?
Well, I'm very happy to recognise the scope for Mrs Bristow and many others to make more use of the NHS app. And the NHS app is all about empowering the patient, and I think enabling the patient to get the right care in the right place at the right time, to get that care, whether it's from a pharmacist or from the additional roles that we're putting into primary care, or where applicable from the GPs themselves. And the NHS app can free up many of the tasks that are currently placed on primary care practices, such as people phoning for their records or repeat prescriptions or some of these other tasks that can be streamlined, and the NHS app is a key part of delivering that.
Madam Deputy Speaker, in my constituency we've lost GPs, we've lost surgeries, so increasing numbers of people on fewer and fewer lists, and community pharmacies are under pressure and some have closed. So people then go to the local hospital, Whips Cross, which is struggling with 100% bed occupancy rates. And he's been ducking making an announcement about funding for the new Whips since he took on the job. And they're struggling every day, by the way, with 100% bed occupancies. So my question is, this is twofold. When will he announce a workforce plan for primary care? Secondly, when will he finally get around to making an announcement about funding for Whips Cross Hospital?
Well, far from ducking Whips Cross, I've actually been and visited in person, so I'm very familiar with the issue, and I recognise how important the new hospitals programme is on that and on the workforce plan. I hope to be able to make an announcement shortly, just as indeed we are doing today on the primary care recovery plan. But one thing which he may want to look at in today's plan is the proposals for us to look at the contribution that is made to primary care from new housing and what changes might be made there to ensure that where new housing developments take place, we can better ensure that funding from that goes not just to schools, where frequently the funding stream goes, but also goes into primary care and GPs in particular.
Andrew Selous.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I start by warmly praising all those who work in primary care in my constituency, including Dr John Henderson and Dr Stephen Price, who lead my two primary care networks. It's great to see another 25,000 staff in primary care. They need somewhere to work now. They need somewhere to work now in the middle of Leighton Buzzard before we get the extra health facilities next year. But could I ask him, when we build tens of thousands of extra houses, my experience back over decades is that no government of either side has made sure that the extra primary care facilities come on stream with as much certainty as the new primary school. And I think if we could crack that, we would do a huge service to the whole nation. And I'd like the Secretary of State to make it his personal mission to do so, please.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, we plan to change planning guidance this year to address this specific issue. He and I have spoken, indeed I visited his constituency, and we resolved one of the issues, as he knows, that he was raising in terms of his estate, which I think was extremely constructive. I know there's a further issue that he has been discussing with the department, but I hope he can take some comfort from the fact that his representations have been heard, and my honourable friend is planning to make changes to the guidance on that so we can better ensure that where there is new housing, contributions are made into primary care.
Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The problem we have with primary care is the fact that we don't have enough GPs for all the demand for appointments. It's not a problem with a telephone system. And in the area that I represent, we have one of the fewest ratios of GPs to population in the whole of the country. So will the Secretary of State support our campaign to train more doctors at Hull and York Medical School, and for Hull and York Medical School to set up a training facility for pharmacists and dentists?
Well, Madam Deputy, we are training more. So I touched in my remarks on the fact we've got 4,000 doctors in training in primary care compared to 2,600 in 2014. We're also looking at how we better retain the GPs that we have. That is why we made changes, for example, to pensions, which impact on around 9,000 GPs specifically. It's also why we're looking at the additional roles to take pressure off GPs. We're looking at how we reduce some of the burden of bureaucracy as well. So we are training more, we're looking at the retention, we're looking at the bureaucracy. So no one is suggesting it is solely, as she opened her question with, solely an issue of telephony or online booking, but these are all aspects that will help relieve pressure on extremely busy primary care.
Luke Evans.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm so pleased to be talking about primary care for obvious reasons. But it is really important because I'm pleased the government's come forward, changed the pensions, which will make a difference for retention. But I'm pleased in the next part of the plan, when I was a clinician myself, 15% of my workload was dealt with chasing letters, admin, these kind of things. And that was borne out in the evidence we heard on the Health Select Committee. So could he comment more about the bureaucracy that he's cutting? And will he ensure that this is just the first step in pushing down on that bureaucracy? Because that will improve the welfare of our workforce, but also improve the welfare of our patients as well.
Well, I know he brings a great deal of experience to these issues, and he's right to focus on the amount of clinical time that is often spent on non-clinical issues. So along with using the NHS app, for example, to send reminders, reducing the do not attends, looking at the interface between secondary care and primary care, which is an absolute key one, looking at those appointments that could be done elsewhere, so through pharmacy, through the additional roles, and the online booking system can better triage people to the right place, and also looking at some self-referral, but not in the way that the bench opposite suggested around internal bleeding and areas which carried clinical risk, but some of those areas where self-referral, for example, on hearing aids, can be done in a way that, again, takes pressure off GPs. Where someone's done a hearing test, that's not something they then need to go and clear through a GP.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Again, I reinforce what's been said by my colleagues. This is a step in the right direction, but it fails to grapple with the grave situation that since 2010, there's been a threefold increase in the waiting lists. It was a 2 times increase by 2019 before the pandemic. In Oldham, we have fewer GPs, more patients with increased acuity. So when are we going to get our fair share of the 6,000 promised GPs in Oldham?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I recognise throughout this statement that there is more demand. We're treating more, primary care is treating 10% more than before the pandemic. There's around 1 million appointments a day, and there is more demand, not just because of the pandemic, but as I said in my opening remarks, because we've got more people over 70, a third more, and they're 5 times more likely to go to the GP than younger people. So that demographic change, the impact of the pandemic, and also changing public expectations around advances in medicine all create additional pressure. That is why it's right that we use the full range of additional roles. It's why it's right we invest in technology in addition to the 2,000 more doctors that we have in general practice.
Vaughan Bailey.
Madam Deputy Speaker, Stroud District GPs, pharmacists and primary care teams do an incredible job for local people, and I look forward to the funding flowing to our pharmacists because many of them have come to make a constructive case for that. But a local GP told me that he believes a national education campaign is needed to advise patients when to access general practice and when to access other services like pharmacies. Given your announcements today, Secretary of State, I think this is a good idea. Is it something that the government will take up?
She's absolutely right, and it is something that is in our plans to have a communication campaign. Often so the front door to the NHS can be confusing people, whether it's in primary care, pharmacy, A&E and elsewhere. So we will have a campaign linked to not just the opportunity to access care through pharmacy first, but also looking at the technology innovations we're bringing on stream, particularly around the NHS app, and we're also making changes to 111 as well. So there will be a comms campaign exactly along the lines that she references.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank all of the primary care workers in my Liverpool Riverside constituency. But despite the Minister's assurances, 600 pharmacies have closed since 2015, having a significant impact on most disadvantaged communities. So would the Minister agree with me that more funding is needed to prevent more pharmacies closing and to fix the broken NHS? And will he join me in condemning Rowland's Pharmacy on Lodge Lane in my Riverside community, who are pulling out of the community and preventing another pharmacy taking place? Thank you.
Well, again, I join her, as I do other colleagues around the House, in paying tribute to the primary care staff in her constituency for the work that they do. We've touched a number of times now on the fact that there are both more pharmacies and more pharmacists than in 2010, and so there is more capacity, but we also recognise the scope to better use the expertise within pharmacy, and that is why there's an additional £645 million of investment that is new funding into pharmacies that's going in over the next 2 years.
Matt Warman.
Speaker, I'm married to a trainee GP, so I've read all 46 pages of this plan. It is an excellent plan. Reading it makes me different to the opposition front bench, but there we are. What I think is important in that plan is it is littered with examples of brilliant practice up and down the country, case studies that should be adopted more widely, and almost all of them come back to the use of technology. Can the Secretary of State say today that he will target the help that is needed to adopt that technology at the practices that need it most, so often in coastal constituencies such as mine?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend. He is absolutely right about the opportunity that tech offers to deliver changes at scale, and the fact that this is technology that is proven, that is working, that is already up and running in many primary care settings. And so often within the NHS, the challenge is not the initial innovation. We get pockets of wonderful innovation. The challenge is how we industrialise that innovation across the wider NHS. That is what this recovery plan focuses on. It takes the case studies to which he refers and looks at how we scale that. And in particular on telephony, around half of primary care does have digital telephony. The opportunity here is to target that funding at the other half, and often that is the smaller GP practices as well as those in coastal communities, because it's the smaller practices often find the transition to tech more difficult, and that is why a key part of this recovery plan is not just the investment in the tech, it's also the investment in locums to provide cover so that staff can make the transition to that new way of working.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The NHS Workforce Plan has been promised for years. Meanwhile, in my constituency in Hull, as my honourable friend says, we are short of GPs, pharmacists and dentists. So will the Secretary of State actually answer the question my honourable friend put to him, which is, can we please build on the excellent work of the Hull York Medical School to set up a dental training school there and a school of pharmacy and also for ophthalmologists as well? That would help in the longer term, but we need to have a proper workforce plan and the government need to get on with it.
I've said several times now, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we will publish shortly a workforce plan. We are committed to that. The Chancellor set that out in the autumn statement. Of course, when he was doing this job and I was previously in the department, we did expand medical undergraduate places by a fifth. So there was an increase then, and I've said already that we will also set out a dental recovery plan in due course.
Jack Brereton.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I very much welcome these plans to improve primary care access, and particularly around the 8 AM scrum, which is neither beneficial for patients nor NHS staff. And particularly in North Staffordshire, we have some very good practices, but we also have some very poor practices, which we need to see those GP practices improve. So will my right honourable friend confirm that these new measures and the archaic practices that we see in some of those GP surgeries will be outlawed, that we will bring in place these new services as soon as possible?
Well, my honourable friend touches on an extremely important point, and for all members of the House, we will bring much greater transparency in terms of variation between primary care settings. I'm very keen that we publish much more information showing within constituencies the difference between the services offered by different primary care settings. We already see that between those with the digital telephony and the online booking and those that aren't, but we also see that in other indicators, and I'm very keen that he and other members of the House get visibility of that.
Jim Shannon.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I thank the Secretary of State very much. The aspects of the primary care recovery plan are very much welcomed, and when the goals are achieved, will be wonderful for the NHS England. In Northern Ireland, however, a very specific question. My constituents are struggling to get hold of their medical records over the phone for PIPS appeals and for assessments. Secretary of State in his statement today referred to improvements in the app system. What discussions will the Secretary of State have with the department back home in relation to the possibility of introducing a way where patients can get their medical records on an NH app as the Secretary of State referred to, similar to the announcement for England this afternoon in the statement. Thank you.
Well, my honourable friend is right to recognise the importance of access to medical records. It's a key part of the functionality we're delivering through the NHS app. He's correct that that is focused on England and not on Northern Ireland, but I'm very happy through my honourable friend for us to have discussions with him and colleagues in Northern Ireland in terms of any shared practice.
Simon Jupp.
Welcome announcement will help patients get prescriptions directly from hard-working, resilient, but sometimes overstretched pharmacies, freeing up GP appointments. Can my right honourable friend outline how pharmacies in my constituency of East Devon will be able to access funding and support to deliver this?
Well, the funding will include for the prescription, so for the 7 common conditions which form part of the Pharmacy First, then that will be part of a new NHS service that will be offered as set out in this plan, and that's what the 645 million over the 2 years is targeted at, and obviously we'll have further discussions with the sector in terms of the rollout of that.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I very much welcome this recovery plan. It's the right thing to do and will make a big difference. But will my right honourable friend agree with me that it's also critical for rural communities to have local and convenient access to GPs? And with that in mind, will he redouble his department's efforts alongside the Buckinghamshire, Oxfordshire and West Berkshire ICB to find a way to fund the construction of Long Crendon's innovative model to replace the old village surgery which had to sadly close under COVID, which will not only deliver first-rate primary care to the village of Long Crendon and surrounding villages, but relieve the pressure on Brill surgery where patients find themselves displaced to?
Well, my honourable friend has raised this issue before and is quite right to champion it. I know it's of huge importance to his constituents. I hope the ICB will take heed of the issue that he raises, particularly in terms of the level of visibility on the estates plan, which I think more can be done to share that with him based on our conversations, and I would urge the ICB to engage closely with my honourable friend to ensure that that estates plan is addressing the very real needs that his constituents have identified.
I thank the Secretary of State for his statement. Point of order, Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Thank you for letting me make this point of order. I'm looking for your advice because you will remember that the first debate in this House